Yet there's not that much focus on what I have focused on in the last couple of years, which is to look at the intersection really between female divinity, agency, power, and just the Quran itself, stretching back into the ancient Near East. The exegetes don't have a genealogical, mythological, or historical depth in their knowledge of pre-Islamic Arabian divinities. Like I said, all we have is Ibn al-Kalbi's Book of Idols, and even that's like a list. These stories, for example, of the, Inanna as this goddess of love, later on goddess of war, who has this relationship with another god and plants a tree in the river. That, yes, it starts, sort of ancient Mesopotamia, but that gets inherited by the Canaanites, by the Arabs, by the Hebrews, by the Nabateans, etc. The introduction of this large-scale violence and conquest by foreign peoples, and then also conversion to a religion that seeks to be monotheistic, that is unified in its godhead as well as its sort of conquering more territory, has a very negative impact on female agency and power and divinity, etc. like that. Sheba is South Arabia. It is the place where they speak Sabaic, and where there is apparently a queen who rules over there. Now, we have zero archaeological evidence for the Queen of Sheba. We have actually no real evidence, no documentary evidence that she existed. We have, as I've mentioned prior, tons of evidence for queens like Sheba in the north. A whole bunch.
Peace, everyone. Something that's very much needed considering what's going on in the world at the time of this recording, but I digress. I'm your host, Tehran, with my brilliant co-host, Roxana, and goddesses from within the Quranic context is not a topic I ever imagined myself reading about. But what happened to the sacred feminine in the transition from polytheism to scriptural monotheism before and during the rise of Islam is a very compelling topic to think about when it was brought to my attention via the work of our current guest. It's hard not to see the Quran's engagement with ancient Near Eastern female deities in the backdrop of its iterations, or how it was articulated in the book that inspired this podcast. Female divinity is inseparable from the Quran's intertextual dialogue and its vivid imagery. And so, without further ado, to discuss his most recent publication, we're pleased to welcome to the Real Talk podcast professor, historian, and author of two groundbreaking books, Queens and Prophets, and the one we'll be focusing on mostly, Female Divinity in the Quran, Dr. Emran El-Badawi. Thank you for joining us on our platform.
Thank you so much, Tehran and Roxana, for having me. It's a pleasure.
And yeah, these two works of yours take us way back into the ancient Near East to examine the political and spiritual authority women once held and what was lost or reimagined when scriptural monotheism rose to prominence, to the detriment of sacred female deities that had a long history of worship in the Near Eastern context. So your book posits that, as I mentioned in the introduction, female divinity is inseparable from the Quran's intertextual dialogue and its vivid imagery. Why then, in your view, has there been so little scholarship exploring how ancient Near Eastern goddess worship specifically shaped the theology of the Quran and its ontology of gender?
Well, thank you so much for asking a very big question all the way at the start. And there is, I've learned with the course of years that there's always scholarship out there that I've always missed something, right? So that being said, there is a lot of scholarship on the Quran, and we're sort of in a kind of heyday of Quranic scholarship, looking at Arabian epigraphy, Syriac Christian literature, various databases that are now making lots of things accessible. So really keeping up with the different trends and varieties of scholarship can be a daunting task. But like I said, it's kind of a heyday, and it's at times it seems like there's a frenzy of scholarship. And that said, yet there's not that much focus on what I have focused on in the last couple of years, which is to look at the intersection really between female divinity, agency, power, and just the Quran itself, stretching back into the ancient Near East. Um, what are some of the reasons for this? What, this sort of absence of scholarship in this area? I mean, some of these are, I'll start with the general and then go to more specific. So one would be what I'd call maybe scholarly mining. Like a mine is something that if you've ever driven past a mine, it's this, that you see machines, they're just drilling and drilling and drilling, and they're just extracting more and more of the same thing. We do the same thing within scholarship. And so we're mining, whether we look at, we're looking at the Quran itself, or we look at tafsir, the exegetical tradition, or we look at, hadith, or even within in Christian scholarship or in biblical scholarship. And within biblical scholarship, they have done a whole lot of mining, but they've covered a lot more territory. I feel like, they've really studied a whole lot, and we learn from their methods. Anyway, another reason, and connected to this, is the normativity of sort of the masculine context and sources and perspectives. I mean, it goes without saying that our sources are all overwhelmingly all written by men. And I have a section on this in one of the 2 volumes in there, sort of looking at men talking about women, or really men just talking about the world. And you can take really, what are some examples in this regard? When we're studying Quran and late antiquity, early Islam, you're talking about a male prophet, a supreme being, yes, okay, addressed in the masculine, right? And the authors of all major Arabic, Syriac, Greek works, these are all men. Even in the Arabian inscriptions, right? The majority of those, and I'm not, there'd be other experts. I know you've had them also on the show. They can speak with more authority on, who the authors are. They overwhelmingly talk about men, but there are some probably written by women, and definitely about women as well. But they're a minority. And then other sources as well. And if you think about some of the major sources within early Islamic tradition, like Ibn Ishaq, Ibn al-Kalbi, Tabari, even within Syriac literature, Ephraim, Jacob of Edessa, Narsai, and on, all men. And their perspective is extremely masculine. It's not as though they're trying to, oh, let me try and, do a sort of social history, a gender balanced history. That's foreign to their worldview. Even within, the problem is, I would say within traditional Islamic literature is it's quite extreme. You have, a category of literature, the biographical dictionary is called Rijal. Rijal literally means men. All right, and it's a great wellspring of data and information. Um, and in the modern context, again, there are all sorts of problems, with male scholars either not citing women scholars and not, considering them fully. And the expert on this, of course, is Keisha Ali. She has a recent book out on, let me get this right, the woman question in Islamic studies, where she really looks at modern Islamic studies, not precisely what we're talking about, but looking at how male colleagues today just have trouble seeing works by female colleagues. Um, Other reasons within an Islamic context, even stretching back to how we look at pre-Islamic Arabia, there's the dominance of Sharia-based discourse. The Sharia is so potent, it is central to Islamic identity, one way or another, whether you want to adopt it or react to it. And that discourse, Sharia-based discourse, again, if you've studied sort of Islamic history, it's sort of this, it involves power struggles between the caliph and, I would describe, maybe the clergy, the ulama, right? Arabs and Persians, power struggles that later on, give rise to what we describe today as Islamic law, theology, governance. All of these are struggles between men, all right? And they dominate how we see both the Islamic and the pre-Islamic world. Another reason, and I quite enjoyed your last podcast with Ahmed Jallad, where he he discussed another one of his new discoveries. All of them are terrific. And he said something which is really important to this is what I do, right? And that's that the looking at Allah, the pre-Islamic Allah, which we find in the inscriptions, it's the same Allah that is connected to El or El in the ancient Near East. I mean, this is something that I don't want. I mean, I take for granted in my scholarship, not because I'm being careless, but because it's there. Because other folks are actually, in my opinion, it is actually careless to divorce the two. So another problem that I would say is the divorcing of the Quran from the ancient Near East. It's taken some work to say, oh, well, we need to read the Quran beside the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, etc. But that's easier to do, even as much as there's contention about it and there's some debate. But it's, the Quran cites Ahl al-Kitab, Ahl al-Injil, etc. So it's that connection. But that connection to the ancient Near East is diffuse. It's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So it's harder to see. And there again, that disjointedness between the Quran and the world around it is bizarre. And the fact that people don't want to make that connection is a problem. And not having access to the ancient Near East means that you're going to miss the dominance of what I've talked about, um, uh, uh, queens and goddesses and priestesses and other categories of very important figures who shape the world, and they're women. But again, we're not looking at them. And there's some examples, going back, over a century ago. Julius Wellhausen did some work on, is it Rechte Arabischen Heidentums, looking at the remnants of Arab paganism, and that was pretty good. Again, it's like really kind of outdated. And then other scholars like Ahmed Dawood, who's an Arab Syrian scholar, this is long ago. He had both a show on TV, but also a 4-volume work, which I read most of, on Tarikh al-Hadarat, but looking at the history of just civilizations, and everything is connected to everything else.
Mm.
So that kind of comprehensive worldview where everything is connected to everything else, the ancient Near Eastern with the late antique, with the pre-Islamic, with the Quranic, with the Umayyad, that is the way I see the world and the way the world unfolded. But then we break things up into different compartments as scholars because we have to, and then we sort of create these barriers. So that has, of course, also limited the scholarship really on women in this area. Maybe one last reason I'll give is, or not a reason, but there's always hope, and there are some works on recent works on pre-Islamic and late antique Arabia and the Quran. Holger Zellentin, and of course. Karen Bauer and Firas Hamza have a recent book on it. Uriel Simonson also has something. And way back when in the 90s, the one very, very important scholar, both in Islamic studies as well as feminist studies, Layla Ahmed, she also she has of course her book on women in pre-Islamic, women in the Islamic world, and that's also important. So there is scholarship on there. It is interspersed. I've given some reasons, but I would say it's also not unique to Quranic studies or late antique studies. I mean, the fact that there's not a focus on women just has to do with the prevalence of heteronormative, laws all around us in every society, East and West.
In terms of placing the importance of placing the Quran in its Arabian context, you argue in your work that there was a 6th century pagan revival of the cult of the goddess Al-Uzza along what you dubbed the sort of pagan corridor running through Ahira, Aliyat, Najd, and Mecca. What led, in your view, to that revival, and how does it provide a crucial background and context for the emergence of the Quran?
Yes, thank you. So I do argue in the Queens and Prophets book for this kind of it's a theory that is based on a mix of literary and epigraphic data. What I say is, to just put more meat on the bones, is that, really in the 6th century, I'm arguing that there's a kind of acceleration of the Christianization of Arabia. And it's something we have to argue, but we have, of course, from the epigraphic evidence, you really look at the past century, 2 centuries prior to Islam, that's when you have all our inscriptions in Arabia are monotheistic, right? They cite Allah, and maybe in my earlier years, I would be very eager to say they're all Christian. Well, maybe they're Christian, or maybe they're Christian and monotheistic. Maybe they're the Hanifs who are writing, right? That's what the Quran describes, these monotheists who are not Jews and Christians. So in this context, really, you get what I'm describing as a kind of acceleration of conflict between the Christian and the pagan, and the monotheistic and the pagan. And I frame this in the sense that, in the north you have Qudaa, this sort of coalition of Arabian tribes who are predominantly Christian, especially the Kalbids, I cite, I think, Zuhair ibn Janab al-Kalbi, who is in the literary sources this hero who's, fighting, these different tribes and desecrating their temples, etc., like that. And in the south, you have the Axumites, especially Abraha, right? And Abraha is someone who, we have inscriptions for him saying, I conquered so and so. So I'm looking at it a little bit from the north and the south, that Arabia is being squeezed from the north and south through these monotheistic forces, which are not at this time, right? They're not being spread by, monks and by, anchorites and missionaries. No, this is war, okay? This is conflict. And in the middle of that, you have the Lakhmids, who are, or the Manazira, who are backed by the Persians. And they are staunchly, anti-Roman, and, and they are, for the longest time, also anti-Christian, because it's part of the Roman identity. There's a lot of literature about that. And I cite, of course, the famous, powerful king of the Lakhmids, Al-Mundhir III, who reigns 505 to about 554. So that's sort of the time frame that I'm arguing this thing happens. Now, Al-Mundhir, by the way, we are talking at this point about the most powerful Arabian king, right? After Abraha, I would say. And his nickname is also, I mean, his not nickname, but I mean, he goes by Al-Mundhir ibn Ma' as-Sama'. Ma' as-Sama', first of all, is a bizarre name. Okay, I mean, water of heaven, right? Or the waters of heaven, like waterfalls of heaven. And that's his mother's name. Why is this guy named after his mother, right? Maybe we can come back to that a little bit later, but that's another indicator that paganism, women, these things are important. These details are important. But he is portrayed in the Arabic literary sources, and later by extension in the Syriac sources that look at the conversion of not Al-Mundhir III, but Al-Nu'man III. The names flip-flop, and it can be very confusing. His conversion to Christianity from paganism, they look at the Lakhmids during the 6th century, especially, I would say, Al-Mundhir III, as quite a brutal and barbaric leader who sacrificed his opponents to the goddess Al-Uzza, right? One of the 3 goddesses who is the star of the show. And if I can read here a section from Arfan Shahid's book, of course, he published lots on this. Among the things that Al-Mundhir did in order to, I would say, counteract or react to the spread of the different Christian tribes, or even Abraha's influence, includes the abduction of 400 nuns or virgins from the congregation of the Church of the Apostle Thomas, his massacring them and offering them as a sacrifice to the pagan goddess Al-Uzza, the Arabian Aphrodite, in 527. He was to repeat this barbarity later in his career when he captured the son of the Ghassanid adversary, Arithas al-Harith ibn Jabala, who dies in 569, dies a little bit after him. And he did this in the 540s and sacrificed him to the same goddess. So again, it's these couple of stories stand out. You have the most powerful Arabian king in the early mid 6th century, just a couple of decades prior to Muhammad's birth and the rise of Islam, where you have Al-Uzza is sort of showing up with force violently. And this is kind of, I get into the different sort of cultic venerations of the different forms of cultic veneration with Al-Uzza. But this version of Al-Uzza is very much tied to warfare and a kind of conquest that is connected to the Lakhmids. Another thing I do, of course, and you alluded to it, Roxanne, in your question, of course. So in the Northeast, you have Lakhm, you have Al-Hira, and then in the center you have Shayban, another tribe, and then of course in the west you have Quraysh. All of these people are worshiping Al-Uzza, right? And I argue that that's the case in the 6th century. So that is what I argue is the pagan corridor. And so there is a literary argument for it, there's a geographical one for it, there's a historical one for it, there's a sort of dynastic one. And it's one other reason I wanted to present this theory, this case, is that we shouldn't think of conversion or religion in pre-Islamic Arabia as just unidirectional. Oh, everyone is converting from worshiping, these pagan gods into Christianity, into worshiping Allah, or into worshiping, Judaism, the same God, right? No, it can go the other way as well, right? Back in those days, you were the religion of your tribal chieftain, right? You just converted with them. That's it was a lot more about allegiance than it was maybe about personal choice. And I know I'm generalizing, but anyway, why are these things important for our understanding of the Quran, or even the context around it? It may explain, I argue, the sort of lingering veneration of Al-Uzza, who is the high goddess in Mecca. If we see in here, Ibn al-Kalbi's Book of Idols, the Kitab al-Asnam, in that book, so the one book that we have in traditional Islamic scholarship that talks about pre-Islam really is Ibn al-Kalbi's work. Yes, there's always echoes in the hadith and in the tafsir about stories that are being told. Yes, that's true. But the only one study that we have is Hisham Ibn al-Kalbi's book. So it's really, really important for me and for those of us who study this time period. And in that book, this he sort of enumerates all the pre-Islamic gods and goddesses, and the one with the largest entry is Al-Uzza, right? And she's in Mecca, and she's out in full force. Immediately after her is Hubal, and I make a small argument about why that's the case, perhaps. Anyway, so why is that the case? Why is Al-Uzza the most important deity, male or female, prior to the rise of Islam? Other than, of course, the monotheistic deity, probably whose name is Allah or Ar-Rahman. It also explains possibly the popularity of the name Abd al-Uzza, which was pretty common. I know that there's an inscription that Al-Jallad also found with his Abd al-Uzza in there near Ta'if, and we have, of course, a couple of Abd al-Uzzas in the genealogy of the Prophet Muhammad and a couple of other Abd al-Uzzas. Like, why is this? This is a strange. It's not like just saying Amr or Al-Harith. Very, very common. It's like it's a long name, and it's a theophoric name going back to Al-Uzza. I think that there's a reason, right? She was popular and powerful and widely venerated, and this is reflected in the record. Even if those people converted to monotheism, that name stuck. Right? This also explains, I would say, the conflict of believers and unbelievers on the eve of Islam and the appearance of the Quran, and I would say, the appearance of broad scale violence, like warfare, This is not a peaceful time where people are sort of, just sort of choosing. No, no, there's a lot of conflict going on here. And it predates anything Islamic, right? And finally, I would say it bespeaks the brutality of the Jahiliyyah. The word Jahiliyyah is a, no matter how you take it, it is a derogatory word. It is a repugnant word, and it's meant to be. Jahil, I mean, is ignorance. Jahiliyyah is a time period of barbarity, right? This is from the Quran. This is not later Muslims who are saying it. So if the Quran is saying that there's this, it mentions Jahiliyyah, I believe, 3 times, and I go through in my text and I describe what it's connected to. And it's connected to violence. It's connected to obstinacy. It's connected to, um, a time period where things are unstable.
Hmm.
So I thought that this theory, again, brought together the different things nicely, and we'll leave it to others to see how persuaded they are.
You said a lot right there, and a lot of it deflated what I was thinking about pre-Islamic Arabia before reading your book. Like, okay, maybe this idea of paganism and polytheism is a polemic against them, and that Arabia was more monotheistic than what the Islamic tradition would have liked to convey. But it seems like what you're saying, and it makes sense that, and I'm thinking of Michael Lecker's article, was Arabian idolatry or polytheism or paganism on the decline before the rise of Islam. Sounds like you're saying that polytheism or idolatry kind of accelerated as a response to the monotheistic encroachments coming from the north and the south, which in my mind would make sense considering all of what you mentioned, the remnants of theophoric names associated with certain gods. Yeah, for me, that was just mind blowing.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that because it's even for me, I'm having to, in the course of over a decade, even adjust my own understanding and beliefs based on the data and the different theories and the scholarship that comes out. Um, and it is sort of an ongoing debate, to what extent was pre-Islamic Arabia monotheistic or polytheistic, or was it syncretistic or henotheistic, and there's all sorts of things in there, and there's a lot of great scholarship on it. But I do increasingly believe that this is a time where this is contested territory.
Hmm.
We are vying for the souls of the faithful. This is there. No one's going to go down easy. And if that's the case, that means you have different groups. So I mean, I've already published on this, right? That this is that the pre-Islamic Arabia was predominantly monotheistic. But what does that even mean, right? I mean, there's still a pantheon in the distance somewhere, right? There's still, like these intercessors or the jinn. They're still there in this monotheistic context. What does that mean? So it is a little bit complicated, and I do think that at least including the pagans in the ring, so to speak, is the right thing at this stage. As we sort of refine our tools and figure out more what's going on.
And then you said some things about the Jahiliyyah, which, I'm starting to see a lot more conversations, not amongst academics, but maybe more so amongst laymen who engage with the academic literature, that, maybe this whole idea of Jahiliyyah being barbaric is a bit exaggerated as well. But the way that you described it, according to how it's mentioned in the Quran, seems like that might not be the case either.
Yes, so let me qualify that. So there's two things I want to mention here. So pre-Islamic Arabia was very much a civilized place with cultures that knew languages and could read and write and trade and had that participated in commerce. And in the case of the Nabateans, were very affluent, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a whole lot that happens there. And women, we can talk about this at length, right? Depending on different contexts, had authority and agency and were sophisticated. And the Arabs were actually not, these savages. That's in general. That's definitely true. But this term jahiliyyah in the Quran is talking about a very specific context where I would say it's really men making war and coming into conflict that is being addressed here. So that term jahiliyyah, I think, refers to the conflict in the time period. But what happened obviously with Islamic tradition is all of Arabia is jahiliyyah, right? All of pre-Islamic Arabia is jahiliyyah. That's where the problem occurs. And so it requires a little bit of nuance to sort of sit down and take things piecemeal. That pre-Islamic Arabia was a civilization, and it was not a collection of savages, but that the Jahiliyyah emphasized that there are certain communities or corners of Arabia which were starting to sort of fall apart and come into civil war. That's what I would say.
Okay.
In terms of just understanding a little bit better the theological context that the Quran is reacting to, you discuss the pervasiveness of Trinitarian models of deity worship, in particular in late antique Arabia, that eventually sort of distilled to this triple goddess cult that the Quran specifically addresses, which is Alat, Manat, and Al-Uzza. Why were these three goddesses in particular so widely theologically important in the region?
Yeah, great. I get excited with questions like this, right? So the tripartite veneration or worshiping in threes, I go into this a little bit in the book, in the Female Divinity book, right? That it's almost in human nature to do so. I mean, all ancient civilizations going back, you look at ancient Europe, the ancient Indic world in India, right? Certainly across the ancient Near East, it is very, very common to have to worship or to venerate triads, three deities in one, three sort of aspects of one god, etc. It's actually very common, even for us as human beings, even myself, when I think of speaking, sometimes I think of threes. There's something sort of, ABC, 1, 2, 3. It's natural to the way we logically want to see the world. So what are some of the reasons for why we may believe or have faith in that way? There's some scholarship on this, of course, that some people say, well, ancient human beings, went out into the wilderness, into the nighttime, looked up in the night sky, and they saw the sun, the moon, and the star, right? And typically the star would be something like Venus, right? Or it refers to the father, mother, and son or child, or the divine couple and child. Or maybe it's the stages of the moon, right? Or stages of the sun.
And death and rebirth.
Or that's exactly the last one I had, stages of life, birth, life, and death, or life, death, rebirth. Exactly. So, and you think again of, things, if you look at the night sky, you think of the sun rising, sort of in the morning, and you have in the noon, and then you have it in the dusk or in evening. So it's not hard to see why that may be the case. You can also, again, you have the different kind of monalities, dualities, worshiping in ones, twos, and threes. Threes are pretty common. You also have, I would add, the daughters of Il or daughters of El. There's scholarship on this by Christian Robin, who writes mainly on South Arabia and inscriptions there, but he just knows a whole lot. And the daughters of El is something that is worshipped in both South Arabia and in Babylonia. And so that's to now get more specific. In Arabia, and I do this in the book, and I mean, I could try and dig it up, but it would be too much. I list as many trinities, pagan trinities, right? Non-Christian, non-Abrahamic trinities. That sounds weird. In Arabia, that Arabians would have, been part of. And I list something like 26. That's just according to me and my sources and research. I'm sure there are actually more than that. And I also list the sort of Christian trinities, plural, in Arabia, and I list 3 of those. And I'm looking here at Abraha has his Trinity, and then of course, the Syriac Christians have theirs, and then within the Quran, citing Surah 5, there's sort of a different version of that. Are you saying is one person of the Trinity Jesus, Yeshua, right? Yeshu, or is he the son of God, or is he the son of man, or is he the Messiah, the son of Mary? All these things make a difference. So I argue that tripartite veneration was a kind of a high standard in pre-Islamic Arabia, right? And that this is basically inherited into the Quran. So in the Quran, again, I cite maybe 3 or 4 examples of the sort of tripartite veneration. And hang on, let me see if I can dig them up. If you just bear with me for 1 second. Yeah, so anyway, so some examples again of what are some pre-Islamic since I'm here, pre-Islamic trinities. There's an abundance, you can have Ruda, Nuha, Atar Shamayin, Wad Kutba Allat, Ruda, Nuha, Shams, Dushara Hubal Manat, Dushara Manat Qais, etc., etc. There is one with Allah. We have Kahl, Allah, and Athar, and Dushara, the Virgin Mary, and the Sun. This is looking at Arabian, Greco-Roman, right? Even earlier than that, looking at Canaanite, in some cases, Canaanite cults that I argue continue, even within Gnostic circles, Serapis, Isis, and Hippocrates, right?
You mentioned that this is nowhere near exhaustive of all the triple deity combinations that existed not only in the Near East, but just, I don't want to say globally, but, in many other cultures.
Yeah, and I would say I want to give myself some credit. I want to say these are the major ones. All right, so these are the ones. So I think if you get the Arabian epigraphists, you get the folks who work on Syriac, you get the folks who work on just historians. They'll say, oh, this checks out. I'm just saying that it's not exhaustive. There's got to be more out there. And also within mythology, it's different than mythology does lead to theology. Theology, I feel, especially in its Muslim and Christian context, is very rigid, or tries to be rigid, tries to reconcile things. Mythology is not like that. Things come and go all the time. People, is Ashura the mother or the daughter? These things change all. It's very, very mutable that way. Within the Quran, you have these triads as well. So I cite in Surah 57, Al-Hadid, Al-Ra'fa, Al-Rahmah, Al-Rahbaniyah, right? It's beautiful. It's all, alliterative, and leniency, mercy, and clergy. You have Al-Kitab Al-Hukm Al-Nubuwah, happened several times. That's scripture, wisdom, and prophecy. And of course, you have in the final surah of Surah An-Nas, the surah on humankind, you have Rabb al-Nas, Malik al-Nas, and Ilah al-Nas, the Lord, King, and God of humankind. So even this habit of worshipping in threes is common to the Quran, I would argue. And to elaborate on this a little bit, there is Manfred Kropp, last name Kropp, has a study on tripartite but not Trinitarian formulas in the Quran. There's some scholarship on this as well. Other people have noticed this. But again, I think the shortcoming of that study was it's too focused on Christianity, which of course, again, you think, oh, well, tripartite worship, that's the Trinity. The Christians own that. No, they don't at all, right? They're just sort of an episode in an endless sort of cycle. To elaborate a little bit more, in Surah 53, which is exceptionally important to the female divinity book, this is Surah An-Najm, one of the earliest surahs according to those who believe in any sort of chronology. There has to be some sort of chronology in the Quran because I can't write 6,000 verses all at the same time. Something had to come before the other. So you're going to have to argue one way or another that something came before the other. In that respect, I do think Surah 53 is quite early. And it says in verses 19 and 20, right? It says, and I'll just read them in English, but have you seen Allat and Al-Uzza? These are names of just, female divinities. And Manat, the third other one, right? It's a weird way to list three. Why don't you just list them properly for me, right? A, B, C. Why'd you say A and B? And then do you just think about C over there? And it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Taran. I argue Allat is this Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat in that order, in the order that it appears in the Quran, is birth, life, and death.
Mm.
And Allat is the most ancient, I would say, attested in the Arabian record, and Al-Uzza being the second who sort of takes over. And I'll get to that in a second, why they're important. And then the last one, Manat, is genealogically distinct from the others. She's not connected to the others. Allat and Uzza are connected, and I'll mention why. But Manat, or in Nabatean Manoth, in Manawat, up further up north in the epigraphic records, it is just this agent of death. It's like lights out, right? There is no creative force whatsoever. It's this dumb force that just lights out, and it's terrifying, right? So you can find it, that sort of odd character. It's sort of like, it even shows up in the Quran. It's sort of like this third other thing, right? This other deity, which is this force of just not even destruction, just of condemnation. So that is where we have the only time in the Quran where God, the messenger, is addressing the pagans, or if we want to call them that, or these sort of idolatrous monotheists, right? Saying, "Have you all seen your goddesses? What about this?" And he starts disputing with them, and we can talk about that later. That is unique. That is striking. In the Quran, we have dozens of times it talks about Ahl al-Kitab, and it talks about Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, oh you who believe. It's widespread, especially in the Medinan surahs, right? But no one ever says in the Quran, it never occurs, oh, Ya Ahl Hubal, Ya Ahl Al-Uzza. It never happens. So this is one argument, again, for the dominance of monotheism, for the dominance of the monotheistic sort of brand. But then you have this example here, this stubborn example of, have you all seen these goddesses that are still hanging around? What's up with that? So that's why it's important. Surah 55, a later Meccan surah, according to those who will go with the chronology. This is an interesting passage. In verse 6, it says, An-najm wa-shajaru yasjudan. The star and the tree fall in prostration. What does that mean? Like many times in the Quran is so cryptic and majestic and beautiful and terrifying, right? In its language. This is an example. It's like, what is it talking about? The star is Allat, and the tree is Al-Uzza.
Yeah.
And this goes back to, the long tradition of Arabian stargazing, and I would say also worshiping the feminine divine in open tree groves. That's why they're coupled together. And that's why earlier it's Allat and Uzza are coupled together. They are genealogically connected because the star and the tree are connected as well. And the cosmology even develops this. If you can think about, if I can think about a pre-Islamic theology, right? I'll talk about the cosmology, the way the world is seen. The tree and the star are connected. And I would end this point on this, the dominance of tripartite worship and its inheritance into the pagan, the Christian, and even the Quranic formulae, is that these are basically staples of late antique Arabian pagan life, travel, trade, stargazing, right? And even agricultural life. And another thing this brings up, talking about these triads and the way they occur in the Quran and how it's connected to the pagans. It's connected to agricultural communities. This is bizarre, right? If I had to come off the street and be like, okay, I'm going to read the Quran. This is the religious text of the Muslims, the Arabs. I'm like, oh, it's all desert there, right? So this is a desert community. Not at all. If I read this text, it looks like everything is green,
Mm.
right? And then they have to go out into the wilderness so they can find, camels and mountains and things like that. It's really that demands our attention. Um, there is scholarship, of course. Patricia Crone worked on this extensively and went to various extremes and came back again. Juan Cole has an article on paganos and kufr, and he looks at, of course, the polysemy of this term. And yes, he has a good idea in there, and I think it's worth pursuing. That are the pagans the folks sort of in the country, and the monotheists maybe something else, something worth considering as well. So I know that answer was a little bit word salad, but
No,
hopefully
it
it's an
was
answer.
awesome. I mean, and just to continue on, how does the tripartite Quranic basmala act as an echo and reappropriation of Trinitarian divine models? Did this monotheistic tripartite model unite North and South Arabia in a way that the pagan trinity it replaced could not?
Yeah, the first one I think I can answer. The second one is a little bit more tricky, but I'll try to get them together. So yes, I do argue, based on just completing my earlier answer, that the Quran inherits this tripartite formula to access God, right? And how does it do so? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And in the translations of those words would be something like, the God, the merciful, compassionate, something like that. It's fine. If we go back even earlier, right? Then those are separate deities, and they've sort of been united.
Yeah, I was
So that
surprised to find that there was a Al Rahim deity that was worshipped.
yeah, and it's I don't know if it's a minor deity, but it's definitely not well attested. Not to my knowledge. And if the epigraphist can find something, I'd love to be corrected. But let me back up for a second. So I would say this to quote, Sidney Griffith, someone who way back when I've learned quite a bit from the Catholic University. The Quran knows its audience, and sometimes if I put on my Muslim hat, sometimes I think that Muslim readers of the Quran today forget that or don't even think that there's an audience. It's sort of just like there's a text
Mm.
and you just sort of read. And if you understand, whatever you understand is what you understand. And otherwise, you look at tafsir and that's sort of it. And that there's no sort of context and audience, and that it's adjusting to persuade. But that's very much the case. So it knows its audience and it's speaking their language. This complex group of monotheists who are, still venerating maybe the jinn and these female intercessors, etc. And in doing so, it adopts, of course, what I describe as the tripartite unity. You'll find, I think, there's some scholarship and even some I don't want to say pseudo scholarship, but in general, I think there's some appreciation for that the basmala has three components. Even the Sufis, I think, have something on this. I read something about it as well. So what I argue is, of course, Allah is the name of the God in the north. It is the normative name for God in the north, in North Arabia, especially the Christian God, by extension, maybe the Jewish God, but we have evidence in the epigraphic record for that being a Christian God. And in the south, you have Ar-Rahman, and Ar-Rahman being the one God in the south, not both, but in three cases, in the pagan, in the Jewish, and in the Christian. We have evidence for that. And then we have Ar-Rahim, who's attested. I find the one attestation that I know, of course, is from Palmyra, but I think that the important thing, the important thing is that Allah and Ar-Rahman are in the formula. And I would argue with some insistence that this is to unite North and South Arabia. For the reasons that I've mentioned earlier with the pagan corridor, and even prior to that, even looking at, Greek and Roman geographers and historians and Pliny and other people who were sort of mapping out the world and traveling with the Romans and looking at, what are the different climes of Arabia and really crafting the Arabia that we think of today, or we think of the Arabia back then, that you have an Arabia in the north, and Arabia in the middle, which is a desert Arabia, and then Arabia in the south, right? Arabia Felix. That you did have different sort of climes or different spheres within Arabia for reasons of climate and other cultural reasons. And of course, South Arabian is a different language than North Arabian, so it's that as well. So, and again, the years of conflict, and of course the wars between the Romans and the Persians and the Axumites coming from there was very much reason to unite Arabia, because it was not united at all. And the episodes where they were united, we can talk about that if there's time. I think of Arabia prior to Islam as sort of it's sort of it's like it's throbbing. There's a tribe which sort of unites and then it contracts, and it unites and it contracts, and that does happen within pre-Islamic Arabia, and the Arabs do have some coalescence and cohesion prior to Islam. It comes and goes, and that's why there's some debate. Where was I? Okay, yes, let me come back here again. So I do argue that having Allah and Rahman is about uniting North and South Arabia, and I talk about tripartite monotheism and unifying Arabia. The result that, what does the Quran want to create? And you find this in is it the late Meccan surahs, I think. If you go by chronology, Ummah Wahida, Ummah Wasat, you have one nation, a middle nation, middle probably between the Jews and the Christians, but you need to unite them. And you do this through religion, through theology, through access to God. And I argue that doing that with this tripartite formula is integral. If I can cite, there's in Surah 26, there was actually a problem. So you have a messenger, presumably Muhammad, he's going out and he's preaching, saying, hey, everybody, let's, this is the last message, and this is what it says. And they disbelieve for many reasons, right? The overwhelming majority, I would say, of the audience do not believe. It's a tough job to be a prophet, I gotta say, in Arabia. I wouldn't sign up. Nobody believes. And in this case says, when it is said to them, prostrate to Ar-Rahman, the most compassionate, they say, what is Ar-Rahman? Will we prostrate to whatever you order us? And it only drives them further away. This is, to me, a very powerful verse. Could you imagine being a prophet saying, prostrate to Ar-Rahman? Like, I am telling you now, show veneration, worship Ar-Rahman. And they don't even say, who is Ar-Rahman? They say, what is Ar-Rahman? Wama Ar-Rahman. Oh my God. Why? Like, that sounds like wow, ouch, that hurts. That's the degree to which there was dissent among the early believers about what to call the God, or which God. No, I don't want to say which God to pray to, but what to name him. They're both male deities. Then you sort of get a reconciliation in Surah 17, verse 110. It says, say, O prophet. Oh, I'm sorry, just say, call upon Allah or call upon Ar-Rahman. Whichever you call, he has the most beautiful names, etc., etc. So it's sort of like, okay, you can call upon Allah or Rahman. There's lots of beautiful names. It's okay. That tells me that audience, some people are going to call him Ar-Rahman, some are going to call him Allah, and it's all right. So I think the evidence is there actually within the Quran for something like this. And I would say that this is, this idea of mine, this theory sort of builds on, in this case, Aziz al-Azam, of course, has this mammoth book on the emergence of Islam in late antiquity. It is a almost impenetrable book. It is so full of, it is a wealth of information, but it is difficult to access. And so I think some folks have trouble getting to it.
I want to say I tried to make my way through it for the Al Jalad interview, and I had it's a thick book with a lot of information, like you said.
Yeah, and his style is, because he has, I gotta say, and this is a tangent now, Dr. Al-Azman, I have tremendous respect for him. Every time I meet him, it's such an honor. He writes about antiquity, about modernity, about the Arabs, about Muslims, but he writes about so many different things. He's so horrifically smart, and that it's hard to consume his books. But I say that out of admiration, and that I have a lot to learn. But it builds on his. He has a theory in there again that that the Arabia and pre-Islamic Arabia, that they were not connected by theology; they're connected by cultic practice. So, you'd have maybe a Hajj pilgrimage, or you'd have a sacrifice, or you'd have a marketplace, and that everyone had their own god. They're at their own nomenclature for how they're going to access God, but that the way they did it was sort of shared. Maybe, okay, we're going to circumambulate, or we're going to sacrifice the sheep, or something like that. So I think this builds on that, and that this is looking to sort of, what, we as Arabia, we need to enter the 7th century. That sounds weird for me to say now, right? And no longer just everybody do their own thing. We need to actually unite and have and worship in the same direction and worship in the same way. So that argues all bound up in this tripartite formula.
Looking at Allah and how he's characterized specifically in the Quran, in Islam, he's understood typically from a theological point of view, at least, as genderless in terms of the Islamic tradition. How does your reading of Quranic imagery challenge that reading?
Okay. So, of course, theologically, within Islam, if we look at, not even Aqidah, but I mean, even just looking at the Quran, Allah is genderless, ageless, unified, omniscient, omnipotent, outside of history. Yes, period. End of story, right? And that's true. And on a theological level, I would say that is true. Scientifically and empirically, though, sort of looking at if everything sort of has a history, then Allah, like all venerated beings, has a history and a genealogy. It has, these things develop. And so I'm concerned with the second. I'm not concerned with the former. And so I always tell people I'm a really bad theologian, and sometimes I say things about theology and people get upset, or maybe I make mistakes, but that's why. Because I'm not a theologian. And theologians are looking, I would argue, this is my argument, that theology really is about reconciling difference. It's about making sense of the world. The world is a very painful, cruel, and sometimes ugly place. And to make it beautiful and to bring beautiful things to it, which human beings can do, theology has a very important job, but it's very different than this kind of exercise. So looking at sort of more empirically, what am I trying to do? I'm not trying to, I would just come back at the question. I'm not trying to challenge that God is genderless. I'm just trying to look at sort of the history and genealogy. And what I argue in the book, towards the end of the Female Divinity book, I say that Quranic God really subordinates all beings beneath him, beneath it, right? And as you know, I mean, the Quranic message is so vehemently monotheistic, right? It's so strict about its monotheism. And yet it still has this history and this tripartite structures, which is what I wanted to bring out. So that's really what I wanted to do, just like, let's be more nuanced about this. So what does it do to the prior entities, to these pre-Islamic beings? The divine, intercessory, demonic, angelic, human, celestial, terrestrial, natural, animal, family, including, of course, consorts and children. All of this plethora of actors, they're all over the place, right? The Quran comes, says, nope, it's all done. And it acknowledges every single one of them and says that it makes them into signs, ayat, right? Every single thing that I just mentioned just now is an ayah. It's a sign of God. In the past, those are actually either divinities or intercessors or something like that. They've all been subordinated, as they should be, because there's only one God, etc. Right? That's the worldview now. And this is interesting. And to quote actually Patricia Crone, if I may, for a second, she says something. She goes, polemics against these gods, angels, and children of God dominate the Meccan surahs, which tell us time and again that God has no offspring, least of all females, that nobody shares his nature, and that everything apart from him is his creation. Now, again, if I put on my Muslim hat, I'm like, yeah, so what? Right? But if you're studying everything, it's like, oh my God, this is like God divorced himself from everyone. Like the God of the Quran is very far away. Now again, if you call him, he will come. He'll be right beside you, right? أقرب إليه من حبل الوريد. He's closer to you than the jugular vein. So the Quran does a very masterful job of emphasizing the majesty and the sublime, magnanimity and distance that God is from all beings, and yet He loves you and is close to you. So that's it's a bit of an adjustment when you have to back up a little bit. So yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'll just say a couple points, and I'm happy to follow up. So the Quranic God unifies and appropriates all Arabian divinities, male and female, into a standard male creator God. That's the standard male creator God of the Jews, Christians, and pagans, right? And his name is Allah in the north and Ar-Rahman in the south. It was already standard that person has that name, and that being, supreme being, as a name, and that they are male by default because of linguistic norms, cultural norms, etc. So theologically is genderless, but in language and in genealogy is male. And that's why, because that's the norm, and that's the convention of late antiquity and the ancient Near East as well. But mainly late antiquity, I would say. And I mean, there's some other things I could say here. Let me just see. One other thing I wanted to mention. This is maybe where some of the challenge that you're looking for comes in. The Quran says that Allah Ar-Rahman, we just read the verse earlier, right, has beautiful names. And we even know, right, this Asma al-Husna, Asma Allah al-Husna, God's beautiful names, the beautiful names. And it's the most beautiful names, al-Husna, right? It's the most beautiful names of the names of God. It makes sense. Whereas the God or gods of the pagans, basically Allat, Manat, and Uzza, are names you have named, you and your forefathers, which God has not revealed with authority, right? And this is a very famous refrain, Asma'an sammaytumuha antum wa aba'akum ma anzalallahu biha min sultan. Occurs a couple times in the Quran. That is really important because, again, we can't take for granted that it's saying, oh, our God has beautiful names. Y'all's gods, they're made up, and it really points the finger over. It's like you and your forefathers with no authority. Da, da, da. It goes on, and I'm like, it's to hammer home that your gods are fake, and they're fake because their names are fake, whereas ours, and again, we have to work in order to make Allah and Ar-Rahman work. But those are beautiful names. I think that's also a deliberate choice, and I think that's okay. But there are consequences. If you say something like that God, who I'm saying here as a male genealogy, has beautiful names, and that the female, right, the divine female, has made up names and has no authority, that has consequences, and I think that's important. I would just point in the two scholars on the Quranic front. Amin Wadud has, of course, Qur'an and Woman. It's a classic book. I think there's a new version of it came out. Kisha Ali wrote the forward. The forward is really great. I love what Dr. Ali said in there. But Qur'an and Woman really it's looking at what I don't know if it's theological or not, but it tries to extrapolate the kind of equity and gender justice from just reading the Quran itself. That's one approach. Another one I would say is Margaret Barker, The Mother of the Lord. She has a couple of volumes on this. She's an interesting scholar, not a very traditional one. I love this book, though. It's very, I think, important. Looking at how, so now not within the Quran, but within the biblical world, and maybe even within ancient Judah, Israel, Palestine, whatever you want to call it, right? That in the Jerusalem temple, there was, you had the male and female god, the Asherah, right? And the Asherah pole was inside the temple, and it was taken outside the temple. And again, that's okay. We want to worship now one God, not two, but that has consequences. You're now elevating the male above the female. So,
How did early exegetes and commentators treat female divine imagery in the Quran? Did they ignore, suppress, or reinterpret it? It's something that I've never really come across reading. I haven't read all the commentaries out there, but the ones that I have relevant to the verses that do mention goddess doesn't seem like they go into it to the same degree that you do in your work.
yeah, and my impression is the same as yours. Most My focus, of course, I look at all sources, but my focus, of course, is on the text of the Quran, which is most important to me.
Mm.
And I wonder to what extent, if it was Muqatil ibn Sulaiman or Tabari or Ibn Kathir or any one of these folks, right? Or Thalabi, when they're looking, I mean, they have a very different worldview than me, right? So, are they even thinking of what you mentioned, the question, female divine imagery? I don't even think that's something that would necessarily cross their mind. I would say, I mean, the whole corpus of Quranic tafsir, exegetical literature, is too vast for me to just answer, in any sort of comprehensive way. But I don't think that the classical sources or the classical exegetes ignored or suppressed, any sort of mention or discussion about the sort of female divine in the Quran. I just think that it was invisible to their world. I mean, it's just right. Their focus was on the juridical and linguistic. They go so much into the words, the meaning of words, and speculating what it was. And they'll maybe, they'll tell stories that, from what we call Israeliyat. Some of the earlier works have this, talking about what Jews and Christians might say. But it's just not, as you said, they don't really get into it because in my opinion, I think they don't think they see it. They're not looking for it. In life, you find what you look for. So if you're a feminist, you're going to find it. If you are a masculinist, you're going to find it. If you're a Marxist, you're going to find it. If you're a capitalist, you're going to find it, right? So it's human nature again. So their world was one again where they're looking at words and little fragments they can use for different ahkam. It's a very different thing. There is, of course, occasional and I would say even a superficial connection between that they can make, or that they do make. So, for example, what is this? Surah 43:19, Surah Al-Zukhruf, I think. It describes oh my God, what does it say in here? I forget now if it's just, I don't have the verse in front of me, if it's Malaika or Banatullah, but it makes the connection. So I think that it cites the Malaika, the angels, and that it says, the pagans connect them to Banatullah, the daughters of Allah. So it has that connection, which you'll get from just reading the Quran itself. And Tabari does this. You'll also have, I've seen this, I can't remember where, but again, Rahma, as again, because of the linguistic focus of the exegetes, Rahma, mercy, it has within it the word Rahim, Rahim, of course, being womb. Rahma is a feminine word in Arabic, and Rahim is clearly a very female object, right? It's the most female object. That's something that comes up. So beyond, I think, superficial linguistic connections and, cross Quranic references, I don't really see it.
Mm.
The exegetes don't have a genealogical, mythological, or historical depth in their knowledge of pre-Islamic Arabian divinities. Like I said, all we have is Ibn al-Kalbi's Book of Idols, and even that's like a list. It's not really, doesn't doesn't tell us anything about these people other than the fact that they were here. So that will be my. I'm sorry, it's not a very satisfying answer, but that's what I come up with, unfortunately.
It's a great answer. In terms of the Quranic imagery you focus on in your work, um, you've already alluded to it earlier. The tree takes a very prominent place in your book, and you talk about how it repeatedly plays a key role in the text's overall cosmology. Can you explain a little bit about how this tree-based imagery in particular connects to discourses or discourses on female divinity?
Yes, sure. So I mentioned earlier that verse from Surah Ar-Rahman, Surah 55, right? That the star and the tree fall in prostration. And this is subordinating, of course, Allat and Al-Uzza to the male god. You have to read between the lines and you have to dig deep and etc. But it's there. Um, so that's one aspect of why the tree is very, very important. But there's another reason also. I mean, I tried when I was starting to write the female divinity book. I mean, that is a whole story how I wrote again this trilogy that I'm writing on women in pre-Islamic Arabia. It's a whole other thing. But when I came to actually write this specific book and make things neat and coherent, I really had trouble. I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to write about female divinity in the Quran, I should start with the Virgin Mary. Da, da, da. I'm like, oh my God, this totally doesn't work. Okay, I should start with Allat, right? The next in line. Okay, no, that doesn't work either. Maybe I should start with their ancient predecessor, Inanna, right? The high goddess, or one of the high goddesses in ancient Mesopotamia. And even that didn't work. I was trying to do what I thought would be coherent to start this, to sort of start off the book. Nothing worked. I really struggled. And then I had to go, you know what? Let me just look at the data that I have. And what is it that sticks out the most? What do I have the most data about? And it all had to do with trees and sort of divine foliage and greenery and agricultural imagery. And I'm like, okay, I guess we're starting here. And that's also, those are connected. That's not for no reason. And I think it's important, again, for every scholar and author. You try something, it doesn't work, don't force it. Go where the data takes you, and where the data takes you is the right place to be. That's where I landed. And I would say about that the organic start of my book was that the trees are so frequently mentioned. And I mentioned, hang on a second, let me pull up over here. So I list over here in the beginning of that chapter, why trees are important, how it's connected to the ancient Near East, and how it's connected to the Quran. And of course, the Quran has what I describe as certain taxonomy, typology of trees. Shajara, Sidra, Nakhla, Lina, all of these are feminine words. They're all trees, right? That's not a coincidence. And these are all connected to fruit trees, olive trees, palm trees, lote trees, and then there's a qum tree of hellfire, which is its own thing. We'll leave that till later. And I say that these are connected to the ancient Near East for the reasons that I've mentioned earlier. So that was the starting point, and again, it's interesting because this is implying that the Quran is operating in a sort of green environment, not a desert. The desert's there, but you have to go to it, whereas the green is everywhere. Bizarre, right? Something to consider, and it's something, by the way, it made Patricia Cohn and other people spin their wheels. Oh, this must have been up in Palestine, or it must have been down in Yemen or something like that. No, it's fine. There's a lot of greenery within Arabia itself, and it was greener back then anyway. So we don't have to go outside the box that far. A couple of points about this, though. The tree is a symbol for the ancient goddess fertility and birth, and I would say Al-Uzza, and her biblical counterpart. So in the Hebrew Bible and in the Canaanite and Phoenician world, that would be Asherah, because they are worshipped in precisely the same way in open air groves, either with one tree or with several trees that are either whole or hewn, that have been shaped. And this is one and the same. And there are some studies on this as well. I mean, I go a little bit deeper into it, and I do argue that Al-Uzza and Ashura are the same divinity, they're just different names.
Especially considering that Al-Uzza represents the tree that you spoke about earlier, whereas the Lot represents the star. So, and then Ashura has the Ashura poles or trees that I had to go and look up to see what exactly they look like, and they gave me the internet gave me one example, which was two trees, as you said, hewn together, kind of wrapped around each other. And then ChatGPT gave me one of a straight poll. Really, I don't even know how accurate it was. You know, it's ChatGPT. It's given me incorrect information before, but it was just interesting to see that connection. Asherah poles, Al-Uzza tree, and your book was the first time I actually, made that connection. So.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that. I mean, ChatGPT and AI are never far behind, right? I mean, actually, what am I saying? They're ahead of us now. We have to catch up to AI. That is what it is, right? But yeah, so I argue in the book for this equivalence between Al-Uzza and Ashura. And Al-Uzza, I mean, of course, is cited even in Syriac sources and even in Greek. She's the tree, but she's also connected to Venus, the star. I mean, again, those are interchangeable for me. And Ashura as well. Ashura is very much terrestrial. She's on Earth, but it's connected. It goes back earlier to, ultimately to Ishtar and Inanna, who are, Ishtar, the word is there, right? It's that connection between the sort of cosmological tree and Venus and the constellations is ancient, and we see it here. Another reason is the ancient cosmology of the Lot tree and trees of biblical paradise. So, and I go pretty deep, and even for me to try and recollect is difficult, right? It's a lot in there. Talking about the trees of paradise, it becomes a very complex discourse. And late antique Christian and Gnostic literature on trees of good and evil, I mean, there's a whole lot about that. And the one important point I wanted to mention is talking about trees in the Quran and emphasizing that this is, integral symbol for the divine female and female agency and power, fertility, birth, etc. Divinity is also connected to paradise and hellfire in the Quran. And how do I say this in simple terms? In the Bible, there's a lot of, maybe we'll get into a little bit later, but I mean, there's stories about burning the Asherah groves when these sort of Israelite kings show up. They're like they totally destroy the pagan worship cultic sites, and these sites are verdant, green, beautiful places, and to burn them turns them into a kind of hellfire. And what I'm arguing in the Quran, because of the sort of double portraits, is you have a tree in paradise, you also have a tree in hellfire. Why is that? I'm arguing that it may be connected to the biblical narrative of the burning of the Asherah groves. And I'll stop there, and we can always elaborate.
So how does Allah in the Quran appropriate the natural regenerative powers that had been previously associated exclusively with Inanna in pagan theology? Does this appropriation demonstrate how entrenched and important the worship of the female divine was in late antique Arabia?
I could just say short answer yes and move on,
Okay.
right? Yes, and I'll elaborate. So in order to obviously worship one divine being and to have different communities come on board, you have a lot of work to do. The Quran does that work, I think, quite masterfully. And God's appropriation, condemnation, and supplanting of female power and its symbols is pretty widespread. So, I mean, the whole natural world, the celestial, the terrestrial, and the human and animal, everything has all been It all belongs to God. It all serves, it all worships God. And it is all signs that point to God, as I mentioned earlier. So, and if I can, let me see over here. I'll read a section from my book. It says, the text subjugates all nature to the will of God. The plentiful signs, quote, signs of God, ayat, instill within the believer profound humility, obedience, and adoration. Therein, the trees, birds, maidservants of paradise, rains of heaven, and nightly rituals are all interconnected. God's sovereignty encompasses his origins in the heavens, his dwelling place on earth, and the birth of the Qur'an. Finally, the text, it condemns goddesses on the basis of gender, and I mean maybe that's a separate thing. And I have a bit of a difference of opinion, maybe with Karen Bauer and Faraz Hamza. They have their book "Women, Households, and the Hereafter in the Quran."
Yeah, I have that on my shelf, and I've been meaning to crack that thing open for the longest time. I bought it at the ICSA
Yeah,
conference, and I noticed that it was mentioned or cited heavily in your book. A lot of other people have given it good reviews, but just sorry, I didn't mean to take things that way.
yeah, no,
That's been
that's
on my
good.
agenda for a while.
That's good, of course, and good memories. London a year ago, with you and Roxana, and of course, um, Firas and Karen are great colleagues, and the book is terrific. And I like even the difference of opinion, and maybe we have time to get into it or not. But yeah, I think that you have to appropriate the things that are important, otherwise you don't appropriate them. To add to this also, what am I trying to say here? I also argue here that some of the appropriation loops in. If we go all the way back to Inanna, who I look at as sort of the archetype, and some folks may think to me as like, Amran, what are you doing? Why are you going all the way back to 3, 4, 5,000 years ago, looking at ancient hymns and stuff like that?
I thought that at the beginning of your book when I was reading, I was like, man, this guy's going way, way back. Let's see where he's going with this.
Yeah, yeah, sure. It's legitimate. It's a
But
legitimate
then again,
question.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep interrupting, but then that only like gave credence to what I read from Gareth Foden that we might want to look at this thing not just within the confines of late antiquity, but as a millennial thing from the first century all the way until the year 1000, which, is of course way outside of the scope, but definitely the way you went downstream definitely kind of taps into that, looking at things a bit outside of late antiquity and going more into the classical period.
Yeah, and Garth Fowden does shake things up a little bit. He wants to shake up the whole idea of late antiquity, and all of these theories and scholarly sort of tools are artificial. Some may sort of have more valence than others, but we have to construct them. No one woke up and say, "Hey, wake up, Muhammad, it's now late antiquity," or "Wake up, Ali, it's now Islamic period." No one does that, right? That doesn't happen. So anyway, to go back to I myself, I want to shake things up a lot, right? And I know some folks, it bothers some people, all right? But the whole point of doing this is we're to avoid that problem of scholarly mining, looking at the same sources over and over again. And, why are the women so absent? Why is it so male dominant? Why are we always, why is it always men on horses, fighting in wars? And I know I'm characterizing, but I mean, there's another world out there. 50% of the world is out there, right? And this sort of invisible other. And I'm so interested in finding who this invisible other is. And you don't get that by just, all day long reading the same sources. You have to be imaginative. And what I'm arguing is there is a very long genealogy. And I argue vehemently, it's not just me. There's a lot of scholarship on this, looking at the ancient Near East, especially the two poles. You have ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt influencing everything in the middle. And you have these Semitic peoples in the middle, where the Arabic, Canaanite, etc., Aramaic speaking as well. They're so shaped by this world, and that there are different layers of course, Persian, Hellenic, Roman, Egyptian influences on them. But we're not considering all of them, and that people, people worship in the same way more than they don't.
Mm.
People stay the same religion. People stay the same religion a lot more than they convert. Okay, these are very basic things, but we know we're always focusing on sort of like what's trendy and what the sources take us to. But the sources are, create an imbalance. Anyway, so this is an effort to counterbalance and also to argue that these stories, for example, of the Inanna as this goddess of love, later on the goddess of war, who has this relationship with another god and plants a tree in the river. That yes, it starts, sort of ancient Mesopotamia, but that gets inherited by uh, the Canaanites, by the Arabs, by the Hebrews, by the Nabateans, etc. It's there. I'm not saying anything that's not actually there. It's just that it's been it stretches back a very long time. Anyway, I know that was a tangent.
No, that was
So
a really good one. I am curious that because nowadays when we see these type of things, people make accusations of plagiarizing, of just simply borrowing. But did those cultures see, did they even notice these kinds of appropriations of things that were in the past? Did they ever make accusations of maybe we're just maybe this is a weird question, but
it's not at all. I mean, that is not. I would argue that's not how they see things at all. It's very, very different. The idea of plagiarism, the idea that one religion is copying another, it's so. It's a very modern idea. Um, And if I could go back now it's okay. We'll talk about it anyway. I mean, within the Quran, though, you do have, of course, the accusation, the non-believers, the majority of the audience in the Quran do not believe the Prophet. They do not believe Muhammad. Like, we can't accept it. And it's very tragic. It's very painful to actually even think about. But that's what happened. And what am I trying to say over here? One of the accusations is, he's crazy. He's possessed. The jinn are talking to him, or that he is actually he's gotten these stories from somebody else, or that these are asatir al-awwalin. These are tales of the ancients. I mean, those all require some nuance, and there's some scholarship on there. I know Holger Zellant and Nikolai Sinai have talked a little bit about this, that this may be, in fact, stories, the missionaries talking about biblical stories and biblical figures prior to the Quran, and now the Quran is saying, oh, this Abraham, Moses, Jesus, etc. Like, oh, where'd you get these names from? You took it from that guy. I think that's a very specific kind of example, but otherwise, the way cultures work, they are entirely organic. One takes from the other, one feeds from the other, and it's again, everything has a genealogy. Um, you look at the words that we use uh, in our religious vocabulary. Where did they come from? They came from the previous people, right? So that's the way I see things. And when I study these things, it makes me feel good. If it makes someone else feel bad, it may be because there's an idea you have which it's being challenged. And the more we study, the more we know, it makes us more humble. And so maybe that's what it is that we're being taught to be humble, is what I think. I still have the point that I wanted to mention here.
okay.
Let me mention it, and then we'll come back to you again. Um, I do this. There's an important hymn in there, and it's not just a 4,000-year-old hymn. It does continue. It's appropriated by biblical and Quranic stories, and that's the descent of Inanna. Inanna being this goddess in ancient Mesopotamia, and I argue that her story, that hymn, is the original salvation story. It's the original for the scriptural traditions. It's the original for death and rebirth and salvation. And of course, that gets taken over, right? Then there's this new guy. His name is Jesus. There's another guy. His name is this, and so they sort of take it over. I think that's important, and I think we should know it. Let me mention something else. It's a tangent, but it's very important. So, the first named author in history is a woman. All history, right? It's Enadwana, the daughter of Sargon, right? And this Akkadian priestess is the one credited with writing these hymns. It's a woman at the very top long ago who wrote these things. And what she wrote is historic because of the reason that I mentioned, but it's also inherited by all these other cultures.
Mm.
And the reason that it seems weird, why am I going, sort of far out in time and place, is because these women have been written out of history. They've been blotted out. So a crime has happened. We're all participating in it, unless we want to try to backtrack and try and reclaim what was lost. That's really important. I can, if we write a history now, and I'm part of that history, and my partner, sort of erases my name from all the history and says, "Oh, here's a history," and all the people after me want to just study that text. Someone afterwards has the right to say, "You know what? No, Ramadan was written out of that history."
Mm.
That's what's happening here, and it happens over and over again throughout Near Eastern history. Let me wrap up this real quickly. God appropriates the power originally vested in Inanna. That's one thing I argue, and he appropriates the power of the goddess and becomes, for example, the bringer of the rain, the harvester of the grain and of souls, and the new Lord over the cycle of life. These are functions prior to the Quran and prior, I would say, to Christianity and the Abrahamic religions. They're very much either female dominated or male and female, but now becomes all male.
Mm.
And finally, another reason why this is all important, right? Who's the most cited? Let me back up. Who is the most invoked god in the Arabian epigraphy?
Allah.
Allah, right? Yeah, right. Even you know it, right? Who is the most widely cited goddess in ancient Sumeria, ancient Mesopotamia? It's Inanna, right? When it flips over to the Semitic peoples, I'm not so sure, but that is so important, right? Because that tells me that it's the opposite. There was a revolution, and it flipped. We were all of a sudden, the divine female. At first, the divine female is so important. All of a sudden, it flips, and now the divine female is invisible.
And as you mentioned, it was also universal compared to male deities, which were more localized. And to
Yeah.
find that the universal female deities have been blotted out the way that they have, and kind of erased from people's memory. Yes, it is something that is important.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Absolutely. I mean, I argue that especially not everywhere, but especially in North Arabia. I mean, you have gods like like Dushara, right? In Nabatea, the one of the male high gods, right? He's the god at the top of the mountain.
Right.
In the Arabic, later on the Arabic sources, it talks about within Mecca, around Hijaz, the different sort of mountaintops, and there was an ancient deity named, I forget his name now, right? Uh, the male deity is at the top of the mountain. And even today, if we get to the Hajj portion or not, it's fine. Uh, uh, when you go for Hajj and you sort of are supplicating God, you go to the top of Mount Arafah, right? And the male deity in North Arabia was at the top of the mountain. Very different than female deities who are associated with, again, Venus, the star, or the trees, we're everywhere, or birth, which is a human function, right? Or rebirth or love. So it goes back into the human psyche and maybe even biology, how femininity and masculinity are conceived of in this world. The masculine has to do with certain sort of, well, at least this is how it shook up out of going to the top of the mountain or having a certain function of ruling like a king, whereas women, there's also the ruling function, but especially the connection uh, to life and birth and human biological functions is very much connected to femininity. One last thing I want to mention about this is the this sort of appropriation is not initiated by the Quran. I describe it, the Quran sort of ends the fight that began earlier, right? It sort of ends it. It's like, you know what? There's no more women for y'all. Okay, it's done. It starts earlier than that, and I agree. I would argue that when you have maybe the Benat Il, the daughters of God, but there's other cases again. We have evidence in again Northeast Arabia with not Ruda, no, Ruda and Allat. Yeah. I think this is Nasafiyaitic inscriptions, and I don't know if it's Al-Jallad or Jerome Norris, someone who deciphered that and dug it up, and I cite it in the book. But that's again that connection to ancient Mesopotamia. The gods, the ancient, so the pagan gods in Arabia are the pagan gods elsewhere in the Near East, and I would say in Mesopotamia as well. So the relationship between Ruda, this male god, and presumably his daughter or diminutive, whatever it is, Allat, is the same or similar to Enki and Inanna in ancient Mesopotamia. There's the high god and the high goddess, and anyway, there's a relationship there which I argue in the book, and you can look at it more. But again, originally Allat was her own thing. I don't, she was subsumed later on under Ruda, and you get this over and over. And I think by the time of the Quran, they're already sort of intercessors or angels. That's why the Quran talks about them as angels, right, or intercessors, because they've already been demoted, and the Quran continues that trend and actually ends it. So I'll stop here.
Talking about how the Quran reacts or works on a basis that its predecessors have already done. Are the Quran's textual strategies any different to its biblical predecessors in the way it appropriates from and deals with competing female divinities?
Yeah, and I would say that's because the composition of the Quran and Bible are so different. I mean, even the Bible itself, the Bible, Biblos being lots of books, it's a library. Whether it's 60 or 70 some odd books, is very different in the Quran, where you have a debated Meccan Medinan connection. The Quran is much smaller, more succinct, a more cryptic, I would say poetic, right? Because it's written in rhymed prose. Whereas the Bible, if you look at just like the Hebrew Bible, right? I mean, it's either a historical narrative or it's a list. Some cases, of course, within the songs, you get some poetic, very beautiful language in there as well. But it's very different. So in that sense, they are different. But also to hone in more to hone in on the question, the Quran is more subtle and appeals to intellect when it's talking about appropriating the power of the female divine. It appeals to reason. The Bible is explicit and violent and right to the point. So let me give you an example, right? Ashura's cult is explicitly condemned 40 times in the Bible. You find it in Judges and Kings, etc. Her idols, sanctuaries, priests, and priestesses are repeatedly exterminated in the text, like they're just wiped out. And her annihilation therein is celebrated on account of the so-called reforms of the zealous King Asa and good King Josiah. This, of course, I'm referring to the burning of the trees and the killing of priests. That doesn't get more blunt than that, right? And that's how they appropriate the power. And of course, the Asherah poles and all, they're tossed out of the temple, and you have just, the Holy of Holies worshiping the sacred name, who's the male god. In the Quran, it goes, if you go back to Surah 53, which is what I argue, that's where the pivot takes place, where the Quran is ending the worship of worship or veneration of female divinities. It's very subtle. I mean, it does it so it says, if I can quote verses 21 to 25, it says, "Do you prefer to have sons while you attribute to him daughters?" This is someone else's translations. "This is indeed a truly biased distribution. These idols are mere names that you and your forefathers made up, a practice that Allah didn't sort of reveal with any authority. They follow nothing but assumptions and whatever their souls desire, although the true guidance has already come from their Lord. Or should every person simply have whatever they desire? In fact, to Allah is this world and the next." That's it. I mean, there's no other passage in the Quran that I know of that, it does dispute again the female nature of the angels. And that, how dare you attribute daughters to me, God, right? That's the extent. And it does it based on appealing to the audience's reason and intellect. It's actually quite sophisticated. Very different than the Bible, where it's sort of like, we butchered them, end of it, and it sort of revels in killing of Jezebel and Athaliah, and it's like these are just demons on earth, right? These foreign queens with foreign goddesses, they led us astray. It's like you blame the woman. Like I went and I started, I committed a whole bunch of crimes. Oh, it's my wife's fault. My girlfriend made me do it. I'm sorry. That's just my opinion.
Um,
You argue that revelation of the Quran itself, detailed particularly in Surah 97, is in fact retelling of an astrological birth story with parallels in both the descent of Inanna and Christian nativity, which you kind of already went into. Could you explain what kind of led you to that bold conclusion? What was the process by which, I'm sure before you started this book, this wasn't something that you um, were aware of, but what kind of led you to that conclusion?
Interesting. Yeah. So there are a couple of passages in the Quran which I bring to the fore because it speaks about revelation, the descent of something divine, and I'm connecting it to female divinity. That's really what this is about. The extent to which I am right or wrong in doing so may be something that others may debate, but it is, I think, is there. It's important, and I go into a lot of detail, as y'all will have known, looking at the passages. So what I do is looking at Surah 97, a couple of things. So Surah 97, Surah Al-Qadr, Laylat Al-Qadr, the typical night of power, night of destiny. Nobody really knows what this word means. This surah is one of several that is short, cryptic, and just so different than everything else. Doesn't seem to be very well connected to other sort of Meccan surahs and things like that. It's its own thing. So that already caught my attention. I'm like, okay, what's going on over here? What are some other things that are interesting about Surah 97? It begins by talking about the night, Laylatul Qadr, right? This is the night and then it ends by talking about Al-Fajr, the dawn. So that tells me, if I am picking up a text, I'm like, okay, this is somehow connected, perhaps, to looking at the night, or some phases that occur from the nighttime until the dawn.
Yeah, it has
Okay.
some astrological significance.
Astrological significance and just the night sky, maybe. So I have those assumptions, and then I start looking at the words, and I just thought, and I am thinking subversively here. I'm thinking of how can I challenge the evidence and how can I challenge the mainstream understanding as best as possible. Again, the idea of qadr and is it connected? What does this word mean? Does it mean qudra? Is it power? Is it qadar? Destiny? No, because then it would say it, right? But of course, it's unvocalized, so maybe is it Laylat al-Qadr? If it was Laylat al-Qadr, Laylat Night of Destiny, then so be it. But I don't recall that, in the different, pardon me, in the different readings or qira'at, that's one of the options. Maybe it is. I know that you had Marijn van Putten on. He might be able to tell us, right? But maybe it's Laylat al-Qadr. I have a totally different take on this thing, as you can tell. And looking at the word qadr or qidr, especially, the intervention here is really Aramaic, looking at Aramaic. And qidr in Arabic, of course, means a pot, and it can refer even to the blackness of the pot if it's from the soot. And it can also just mean, in Aramaic in general, it just means black, dark, right? Well, that makes sense. And then when I look at the night, it's totally black, right? Oh, this is good. And then the word khair, and I'll read my translation at the end, right? Khair being brightness. Khair is an Arabic word which can mean better than, right? But if I can back up for a second, Arabic is a language which separated allophones into different phonemes. What am I trying to say here? Ha and kha, the letters ha and kha. Again, if you know Arabic, it's like, one is well, anyway, more fricative than the other, but they are originally they were originally in older Arabic and Aramaic dialects, just one letter. And as Arabic developed, it separated the two into ha and kha. But the Quran doesn't necessarily, I mean, it may or may not have that. Again, I know that other scholars may dispute this. But if instead of khayr, it's khayr, right? I mean, it's the same word, it's the same letter. It can refer to brightness and whiteness. And this is actually where Christoph Luxemburg got his whole argument about the white grapes. Hur, ain, hur, and khayr. They have the same root, I would say, right? In Old Arabic. And then finally the word shahr being moon and not month. Now the word month and moon are the same thing. They're actually the same thing in English. They're the same thing in Arabic as well, by the way. Same thing in French, right? And then another problem in there is, who are al-malaika wa ruh? Who are these? Towards the end, the angels and this spirit or soul. Maybe they're the angels and the Holy Spirit, but it doesn't say ruh al-Qudus. It just says ruh. Don't know why. And then I make an argument, of course, that this goes back to the descent of Inanna, the hymn that we discussed earlier. Let me read my translation just for the audience, your audience, see what other folks think. In here, of course, I cite a translation by Muhammad Asad, and then by Christoph Luxemburg, and then by me, the Al-Badawi translation. I'm just going to read mine. We descended it in the night of darkness. And what do you know about the night of darkness? The night of darkness brightens to more than 1,000 moons. The angels and spirit descended into it. By permission of their lords, every word, it is perfection until the rise of dawn. It's still cryptic, but the whole light and dark thing makes a lot more sense to me here. And let me just try and wrap it up here. So I'm saying here that this is a birth of the Quran ? Right? That's sort of where I leave it, because this is typically taken by the exegetes, by the mufassirun, as this is a story of the descent of the Quran from the heaven to the earth. Yeah, but it's told in this way where, especially with these use of tanazzala, and there's a lot of scholarship on nazala, tanzil as revelation. It's also connected to, I would say, childbirth, right? And I'm making that case, and others may be convinced or not. Anyway, that was that.
I mean, one thing that I found fascinating about the analysis in particular was how it might impact our understanding of like the timing of Ramadan and Laylatul Qadr and the astrological significance of those when the revelation actually took place, because obviously in Islamic tradition those things have a very specific timing, and you complicate that a little bit.
Yeah, I do complicate it, and sometimes I wish I could simplify rather than complicate. And this gets to Surah 2, 185 mentions Ramadan, famous month. Let me read the passage. This is not my translation, but I'll read it, and this is in English. Oh no, hang on a second. This is my translation. Okay, I'll read my translation here. The moon of Ramadan, under which the Quran was descended, is guidance to people and proofs from the guidance and salvation. So whoever among you witnesses the moon, fasted, and whoever is sick, etc., etc. The intervention there, of course, is moon instead of month, because I don't know about you, when I go out and I look out in the sky, I don't see a month. I don't see a year. I see moon, I see sun, which is where those things come from, right? That's why there's the one-to-one. So that's why I translated it as such. But the idea, this is sort of the second passage that I am adducing, that I'm citing, that has some sort of birth narrative here. I'm combining here, looking at the different lists of months in the ancient and late antique Near East. So you have, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but the North Arabian months, the South Arabian months, the Babylonian, the Syriac Christian, the Egyptian, which is different. So the Egyptians and the Romans had their own sort of solar tradition, but then the ancient Mesopotamians, Babylonians had the lunisolar month, and they have intercalatory days that they put in there. That's the one that the Quran and Islam adopts. It belongs to that Babylonian tradition completely. Whether it's North or South Arabia, same thing. And what is interesting is that I have this Surah 2, 185, and then I have a list from later Islamic tradition looking at the one of the two North Arabian lists of months. And it starts Muharram al-Awwal, Muharram al-Thani, Rabi' al-Awwal. It has the months that we all know, that every sort of good, pious Muslim knows. And the ninth month is Ramadan. And it may be very naive on my part, but I'm like, why is Ramadan the ninth month? What's going on over here, right? Is that a coincidence? Because all this birth and rebirth that I'm talking about, I'm like, all of a sudden now that the Quran is born in the ninth month, or it's revealed in the ninth month, it sounds like a birth story to me, because that's the gestation period for a woman to have a child is 9 months. Just an idea. That's the assumption. And if I'm completely wrong, someone is welcome to empirically prove it. And I look at, of course, the different lists. There's scholarship, again, looking at the Jewish and Christian months and what they mean. And I list that as well. But ninth is the month that is going back really to ancient Near Eastern mythology, is the month of conception. It's where, again, and this is the different hymn, the courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi. So Inanna is the goddess, Dumuzi is the god, and they mate, right? And they conceive a child, and that's that month. Now, that's not the month of birth, it's a month of conception, so it doesn't work out perfectly, but that's the month that, if we combine what the Quran says and what later Islamic tradition says, that's when it chooses to say, this is when the Quran is revealed. I think that's significant. And again, it says unzila again, and I take that verb nazala to be connected again to childbirth, and I get into it in the book. But those are my reasons for doing that.
You argue that Surah 53 in the Quran acts as a particularly crucial bridge in the calibration, sorry, of the balance of power between the female and male divine. You describe it as the fateful moment in history which hammers in the death knell of female divinity. Why is this surah so significant as a literary and historical witness to the permanent shift in patriarchal worship?
Okay. Right. So, as I mentioned, Surah 53 is extremely important. And the death nail analogy, of course, there's some drama and bravado there. And I did that because I really wanted to demonstrate how important it is and how the finality of there's no more female veneration of the female divine after this. It reemerges in Islamic tradition later on. I mean, there's a great book by Allah au Féminin by Eric Joffrey. It's looking at the female divine in Sufi circles and Sufi practice. It's a great book. Okay, anyway, let me come back here again. I do this section on where I really break down Surah 53, Surah An-Najm, entirely from beginning to end, the entire surah. I call it contesting female power. So Surah An-Najm does many, many things. It's fascinating. First of all, it's called An-Najm, the star. So that's already, it's already one thing. Is this, which star are we talking about here? And these are a group of people which throughout antiquity are known, the Arabs that is, for stargazing. And even before and after, they use the stars to travel. And even later on in Islamic cultures, they developed out of Greek technology, their own technologies, with looking at stars to travel, to traverse over the seas. So stars are incredibly important. And let me read a section, if you permit me, from this. Okay. Quran 53 is the only surah to explicitly list pagan idols while addressing its audience. The deities were of northern or Nabatean origin, but worshipped across Arabia. Later Islamic tradition linked the surah to the pagan priesthood of a male figure dubbed Abu Lahab and his wife. I get into that later. The deity is named in Quran 71:23. and ascribed to the people of Noah are, by contrast, part of a narrative more closely associated with Himyarite or South Arabian cults. Those are the only two times in the whole Quran where it lists pagan deities, right? So we have, what, 5 here and 3 there, 8 total. But otherwise, the Quran is totally concerned with a monotheistic discourse and an audience which is leaning monotheist, which worships Allah. Quran 53 is a unique source recalibrating the balance of power between female divinity and male prophecy. That's what I'm framing it in that way. This is because the surah is simultaneously a literary text and a documentary witness. There is, of course, ample scholarship on the many fascinating and rich dimensions of this chapter. For our purposes here, it functions as a bridge between. So it's a bridge between many dualistic or many sort of pairs: the celestial and terrestrial, the pagan and the Judeo-Christian, the historical and the metaphysical, and the female and the male. And really, every good student or believer should go back and read Surah 53 and meditate on what I'm talking about, because it's there, and you can come to your own conclusions. And it's beautiful. It really is. It's fascinating. So Surah 53 functions as a kind of treatise, both about and against female power in late antique Arabia. And the point here is, this is not anti-woman. This is just, we are crafting the new way of how to worship Allah. This is the God that everyone's already worshiping. These are the norms that everybody already, abides by. But we can no longer, sort of tolerate any, dilution of the Godhead, with the pagan or the female, etc., like that. And again, those have consequences. So let me mention that I'll summarize a little bit because it would take too long, but I do claim that in Surah 53, what happens here is the surah does, in its process of very methodically and poetically laying out its message, and and talking about Lat, Manat, Uzza, and the pagans, and the majesty of God. It is condemning the female names. It is, I would argue, reforming or even rehabilitating the Christian God, and that it is also supplanting Allah's wisdom. And let me pause on those a little bit. So condemning female names, we talked about a little bit. Reforming the Christian God. Allah has the name, it's the year 600. Who is Allah? He is the God of the Christians. Is he the God of someone else that I don't know about? So for him to be the God of Muslims, who are, who are the Muslims? They're in large part, the Christians and Jews that convert, right? Maybe, probably. They have the same God. It's the same God. But we in a sense, the Allah of the Christians, again, is diluted in that it's associated with the Holy Spirit. It's associated with, Mary in this way. And so making Allah uniquely one, and that unity is something that happens also in Surah 53. And then one thing that's very subtle, you have to go really deep, is supplanting Allah's wisdom, because Allah knows, Allah does not know. Allah has wisdom, He's omniscient. Allah doesn't know anything. What am I saying? You have to go and read the book in order to get those details. One last thing I'll mention about this is, I believe that Surah 53 is so ancient. I have held this belief for decades, and I don't know how to even divulge it, but it's just, I feel that this is an ancient prayer. Like, this is a very ancient, there are vestiges of an ancient pagan prayer here. And because I just get that feeling just by reading it, right? It just feels so archaic. But that even within Islamic tradition, you get Qissat al-Gharaniq, right? The story of the cranes. What's the story of the cranes? In popular modern literature, this is the satanic verses. Salman Rushdie has his book, Satanic Verses, from the 70s or 80s. I read it a long time ago when I was still a kid. I I wasn't so impressed. I don't know, but I mean, I think he's a good author, but I just found the book to be whatever.
You know,
Just
it seems like the controversy around the book was more impressive than the book itself.
Yeah,
Because, you know,
yeah.
I rarely hear people quote it. It's just more what it was supposed to represent rather than the content. So I don't think it definitely dissuaded me from reading it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So y'all feel the same way? Yeah, I just feel like there's a whole lot of bluster, and I'm not sure what the whole big deal was about. But anyway, so that he sensationalized this story of, oh, satanic verses. Well, what are we talking about here? It goes back to Islamic tradition, so not the Quran and not the modern times, but somewhere in the middle, but pretty early. Um, the Islamic tradition, and you'll find this in the Hadith, you'll find it in Tabari, you'll find it everywhere, right? They talk about Qissat al-Gharani, the story of the cranes. This is bizarre, dude. This is crazy. The one episode where Islamic tradition claims, you know, Muhammad got it wrong. The Prophet made a mistake, and it was not like it was like a big mistake. And it's أفرأيتم اللات والعزى مثلا. Okay, إن شفاعتهن لهي ترتجى, right? It's like, have you seen Allat and Al-Uzza and Al-Manat, the third other one? Instead of saying, are you going to give me the males and you take the females? Instead of that verse, it says, oh, indeed, their intercession is to be sought after. And this is a kind of, it's weird because it's saying, yes, there's Allah, but these three goddesses, we can still use them as intercessors. It's okay. Now, again, it could be totally false, but and when I first heard the story a long time ago when I was a student, I thought, there's no way this is true. There's so many stories in Islamic tradition. There's no way this is true. But with time, I'm like, why would they say such an extreme thing about the founder, the messenger? And it seems as though they also believe that this surah is so important that it had a sort of um, it crafted the kind of norm for how we would worship God. No intercessors, no female deities, because it could have gone another way. We could have tolerated that, but no, we're not going to tolerate it. Anyway, I won't belabor it. There's some also typologies with male and female. If we have time, we can get into it. Otherwise, that's in summary my take on Surah 53, which is very important.
One other interesting dimension of your analysis of that surah and its condemnation of the worship of the female divine is its connection to cultic rites performed during Hajj, which you sort of referred to a little bit earlier. Could you explain this connection? Because I found that absolutely fascinating.
Yes, and thank you for the question. Let me just dig up over here. I may want to read a little section over here. Okay, let me read the section. So there is yet one more dimension to Surah 53 and its role in curtailing female divinity, which is hitherto unexplored. This is namely its connection to the Islamic pilgrimage or Hajj. To this end, there is an old story about the origins of Hajj ritual, and it claims something about Abraham and Satan, etc. I'm just skipping that part because I think it comes apocryphal. It's later. This apocryphal tale retains at its core the Abrahamic iconoclasm against the cult of Arabian goddesses, the so-called daughters of Allah. Among them, Al-Uzza was worshipped in open tree groves like Asherah from the Hebrew Bible, or Inanna from ancient Mesopotamian mythology. And Allat was often worshipped or represented in the form of a stone batil or stone block. This rich discourse on female divinity in pre-Islamic Arabia has been discussed at length, though, throughout this book. So yeah, the 7th century believers would begin performing the annual pilgrimage towards the large batil in the center of Mecca, known as the Kaaba, having been newly endowed with the male power of the biblical patriarchs Abraham and Ishmael. That is still an ongoing, how did this happen? It's an ongoing debate. Although the founding of that city in the Arabic sources is more immediately tied to Hagar, whose importance is regarded. Let me skip a little bit. For the new generation of Arabian proto-Muslims, the early believers, to fully embrace their Abrahamic destiny, they would need to permanently break with their pagan past. This iconoclastic goal had a major impact on shaping the pilgrimage ritual, as the faithful were to, quote, stone the devil in the form of 3 small batiles. And I'll stop there. What I'm saying is this. In North Arabia, the divinities, including, I would say, the pagan trinity, the 3 female divinities we've been talking about now for quite a while, they're worshipped either in open air groves, or they're worshipped frequently in the Nabatea Hijaz region as stone blocks. And there are Kaabas all around Arabia. There are cubic stone blocks all around Arabia. There are a couple, I'm forgetting now, but it's all in the book, right? There's one in the south, there's one in the north. And of course, the female divinities are worshipped as possibly a golden statue in Al-Hira with that big king who's killing everybody, right? He's just such an overblown dictator. He has to have a golden statue to worship anyway. But otherwise, what's really, really common is these stone blocks. Is it a coincidence that there's a good stone block and there's these bad stone blocks? What are they, right? And why are the bad stone blocks? There's 3 of them, right? And then there's a good stone block and there's 1 of them. And I do believe that that single stone block, which again represents the Kaaba, there's a story with Abraham and Ishmael, which I think comes later on, and then that this is a place where, ultimately you circumambulate so you can worship Allah. All of these things are different things that are being put together. And there's research on that. What about the Rami al-Jamarat, right? What about those 3 the stone blocks where you're stoning the devil in outside Mina, and you get the stones from Muzdalifah, and you go to Hajj. When I was young, a long time ago, I went to Hajj. I actually did this thing, right? So I recall. I was very, very young. And now, by the way, the stone blocks have changed over the course of centuries. Now they're like huge towers, and the old stone blocks have gone. But this is bizarre again. Why do we do this? Why is it done in this way? And I am arguing that it is possible that those 3 stone blocks are Allat, Manat, and Uzza. It would make sense. Also, I think Layla Nama has an article. She, of course, works on North Arabian inscriptions, Nabatean inscriptions, and others. I hope I'm recalling this correctly. They may be in that volume where she published with Fred Donner, was my mentor. What was in there? I think it's looking at the Arabian inscriptions, the religious references, and in that intermediate period, so not where the Arabs are worshiping lots and lots of gods, and not where they're entirely monotheistic, but somewhere in the middle, the gods that are cited in the inscriptions are Allah, Allat, Manat, and Uzza. You have these 4. I couldn't believe it when I saw it. I'm like, wow, is that really the case? So in the act of consolidation, appropriation, condemnation, to bring everything together, I think the Hajj does that, and it does so masterfully. And I'm focusing again on the 3 stone blocks that I would put on Muslim. We have to stoning the devil. And again, that's okay, but that has consequences, because if that is true, there is a kind of, I would argue, kind of demonization of female divinity and a kind of extolling of male divinity. And there's nothing we can't change in life today, but we have to know these things. So that's why I presented it.
How far does the widespread worship of female divinities in the region challenge the narrative of marginalized and oppressed Arab women in the pre-Islamic period? Because one of the things that I tried to convey via social media was that considering the heavy worship, the amount of worship, or the importance of female divinity in this period, like, what does it speak to the social and cultural impact that it had on women? Now, I don't think people on social media, especially Twitter, can be very messy where really understood what I was trying to get at, but that is something that I was thinking about while reading your book on female divinity. Like, what kind of social and cultural impact does the worship of female divinities have on the region versus kind of what we're taught about the rights and status of women from the Islamic tradition in pre-Islam?
Yeah, this is so big, and so this goes back to the earlier book, Queens and Prophets, mainly, I would say. And it's how widespread was the worship of female divinities, and what does it say about the status of women in pre-Islamic Arabia, and how does it agree or disagree with the Islamic narrative? All these are big questions, and I think we can guess, and we can give our best guess based on evidence. And I know that even the extent to which I've argued things in the first book, as far as what are the implications, and this is stuff that people will debate. They're not going to take it necessarily at face value, but they can't ignore it. That's one thing, right? So, let me maybe start by reading a little passage and then elaborate from there. So this is from Queens and Prophets. This is all in the beginning when I talk about defining female power. I said that I'm referring to the agency of female nobility throughout society, notably their capacity to rule independently, undertake warfare, and conduct trade. So that's me trying to be specific with some sort of method. My research seeks to rebalance decades of scholarship that overstate patriarchal influences within the region's politics, religion, and culture. It also challenges popular assumptions about the marginalized status of Arab women in pre-modern history and their perceived absence from public life altogether. So those are just some little nuggets that I try to, use to guide me. I am looking at Arabian noble women, right? I'm not looking at average everyday women. That's one, caveat right there. So I'm already looking at sort of the elite. So if I consider myself, oh my God, I'm the first scholar to do something like this. I'm not the first to do this. I mean, I'm the first to do precisely what I'm doing, but there are others who are working in this area, not too many. But if I consider myself the first, then what will be the next thing is to have somebody look at the Arabian, average everyday women, the sort of the working class women. So that's one limitation, but that's really a next step, and it's, I think, much more challenging to do that. But the noble women, we have references from 9th century BC all the way till the medieval period about women, queens, chieftains, empress. So let me mention over here, we have queens and independent rulers in the north. So North Arabia, Syria, Mesopotamia, we have independent rulers who are women. And they do the things. They conduct trade. They undertake war. They're in charge. They send men out to do things, etc. We don't really have that in the South. That's one thing to keep in mind. I argue that over the course of late antiquity, there's a decline in queenship, especially because of Roman conquest and Abrahamic conversion. Now, those are very broad things and require a lot more discussion, but I do think that the introduction, and there's evidence for this, the introduction of this large-scale violence and conquest by foreign peoples, and then also conversion to a religion that seeks to be monotheistic, that is unified in its godhead as well as its sort of conquering more territory, has a very negative impact on female agency and power and divinity, etc., like that. And I, of course, use in the first book, the archetypes of these sort of who are the women heroes in pre-Islamic Arabia. It's Empress Zenobia, Queen Mawiyah, and Lady Khadija bint Khuwaylid, who was the first wife of Muhammad. And she's a really big deal. And we can, in the book, she's the center and not him. So I would say that the rebalancing and the adjusting needs to be that there are powerful women in Arabia, and they did things that men would do, like they would rule, they would own property, they would, they would conduct trade, but over the course of time, less and less so. So it may agree or disagree with the Islamic sort of the traditional Islamic perspective on the Jahiliyyah in the sense that, oh, were women all marginalized? No, they were not. But was everything honky-dory? No, it was not. And the nuances, again, I'm saying that, the introduction of this wide-scale violence of conquests and conversion, Abraha and Zuhair ibn Janab al-Kalbi and all these other, this severely diminished the autonomy that women exercised, but that they had it, and that things probably got bad pretty quick towards the end. Um, I'll mention it now. I might mention it later again, but it's just, that we have this genre of literature called Ayyam al-Arab. It's part of the whole, the days of the Arabs. The days of the Arabs refers to the battles, it's battle folklore. It could be me sitting here in the US. Oh, remember the good old days, when we were this Mexican-American War, the independence, etc. It's like that. It's sort of like, war stories. And why do we have war stories? And again, we're always thinking we're biased. We go right to the sources. We look at what Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma said, what Ibn al-Qais said, and we're like, yay, look at this. Yeah, but what's the context of that? It means more war, more violence, which means what? It means disruption of trade. It means disruption of the different sort of patterns of rule and disruption in dynastic structures and gender relations. I mean, it disrupts everything. And really the Ayyam al-Arab, this is maybe for a future project. I have a list of projects that I'm probably never going to get to, but they're all there. I'm a good scholar in that way. I'm all backed up. So, and it's like 100, maybe 200 years prior to Islam, things start to get bad. So I'm arguing that women in Arabia, especially, I compare this other literature looking at barbarian societies, the non-Roman societies, like in the up in the UK, right? But back in Great Britain, that those women and other places in not necessarily in Italy, but other places in Europe, and certainly in Arabia, women were rough and would tumble, and they'll go out there and do their stuff. Right? That's important. And people need to keep that in mind. This was a society where women went out there, and you see echoes of this, even in the hadith with like Aisha, who's like, the youngest and favorite, and I would say the most spoiled wife of Muhammad. Like, oh, everyone, like she would get jealous very easily and just, she'd, tear up throw the dish on the floor. And then there's a hadith about that, by the way. And yeah, they were tough women. These are tough women. And they're not to be, sort of trifled with. And the fact that, the status of women or that any sort of infringement upon their autonomy came from men who were fighting with each other. So that's the nuance in there. But so I do think it's an important message for everyone, believers, scholars, whatever it is, that women were there and they were involved in public life, and that the worship of goddesses is a function of demonstrating that women were involved in public life at the very least, and especially noble women. Yeah, they're and that's why we even have hadiths. This is for the next, if we talk about the next book, there are hadiths which are just anti-women. They are, and they do that because they're women who are exercising all sorts of power. So,
and you kind of have to kind of juxtapose those hadiths with what you just mentioned. I mean, as we know, when it mentions any kind of group in the hadith literature, not to say that it's anachronistic or was written much later and projected backwards, but you almost have to assume when it mentions something about the Khawarij or such and such, Persians are such and such, that it might have been dealing with certain iterations of those groups that weighed heavy on the scholarship for them to, I don't want to say make up these hadiths or construct these hadiths, but for why the proliferation of such hadiths might, be around.
yeah, you're right, and the hadith is more complicated, but it is something I will be getting into in the next book. So yeah.
Just to explain a little bit about how you already touched a little bit on this, but how the cult of the goddess in particular was inherently tied to Arabian queenship and more general female political social agency. Why were those two things so, interlaced together?
Yeah, so I would argue that they're tightly interconnected. or interconnected for sure, in some cases quite tightly. So, and to quote Hatun Al-Fasi, she has a book on women in pre-Islamic Arabia, looking at the Nabatean world. To quote her, and I'm translating from Arabic here, Arab men gave women respect and consideration, worshiping her as goddess, obeying her as queen, and submitting to her as priestess. These three functions are supremely important. And they're so important that, again, if you had to, what was Arabia like pre-Sharia, right? What was the birthplace of Islam like before there was such Sharia? We had these three things is what you had, right? And again, they're just not on the radar. The priestess is so important. And what I argue again is that there's a ancient Near Eastern influence all day long, right? Ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and the fusing of nobility and divinity. And what is it that combines me as queen with me as goddess or the goddess? And that's the function of the priestess. That she's the bridge. So anyway, that's there. We also have evidence from art and architecture, the sort of art historical record, the material culture, that where you can see, in visual form, how the queens and goddesses look either similar or the same or occupy the same space. And it's not strange, again, you see this in ancient Egypt all the time and other places or ancient Assyria, where the king or queen is going up to the king and getting blessing or something like that. Let me read a section here. There is evidence for the blending of queen and goddess, most likely Ishtar and Atargatis, during the reign of Shuqayla 1 and 2. These are Nabatean monarchs or queens. The queen and the goddess were adorned with the same features, including the crown of leaves and other symbols of fertility. At the Temple of Wings in Petra, the statue of Al-Uzza is that of a queen in appearance, donning a crown, veil, and earrings. Evidence suggests that the cult of Al-Uzza spread to the Sulaymans of Al-Hijr. This is a clan purported to belong to the pride of Sheba, appears later on with the Arabic sources in Muhammad. There is furthermore evidence from Hegra and Petra that Queen Huldu was high priestess and protector of Allat and Manat, and that she adopted the crown of Isis, the Egyptian equivalent to goddess Allat. Ptolemaic queens were readily identified with the goddess Isis or Tyche. Al-Fasi adds of Huldu that it seems that she represented the qualities of Isis synchronized probably with one of the major Nabatean goddesses. So that fusing, I think the passage says it all, that fusing of goddess and queen was very common, and you see it in the artistic record. Like I said, I quote Al-Fasi on this one, but there's other evidence as well. And I think it's logical. This is the noble class. And I'm not saying, by the way, this is not like a soliloquy in praise of women only. I mean, these are elite women. They're the ones who they have privilege and power, and maybe they're abusing some of it, right? They're not the everyday women. And one of the privileges is you get to be priestess or goddess, right? Not be goddess, but you're depicted. They're depicted like you, and you're associated with them. So that's a privilege of being a noble woman.
Was the loss of freedom enjoyed by pre-Islamic women, like polyandrous marriage? I don't know if that actually existed pre-Islam. I know that is what the tradition says, but let's just say that it did. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. Structures of matrilineal descent and the ability to divorce without consultation, something that was inevitable due to the shift in the dominant theology of the region. I mean, first, was the Islamic tradition kind of right in how it describes the relationship? Some of what it said about women in the past.
Well, to answer that second question, to a large extent, I think yes. And I think the part that's a problem with how does Islamic scholarship or traditional Islamic tradition how does Islamic tradition depict women in pre-Islamic Arabia or marriage? It does so again in this sort of derogatory way, but behind it is there's real stuff going on. And to get to your question, I found this, you're reading my mind. This is actually the next book is a lot of it. The next book is about this. And when you mentioned polyandrous marriage, that is this is going to be so debated and or ignored. Some people may be like, this, I'm not going to consider this at all. But it is there, and it's something I'm going to get into in the next book. Let me back up and say this. This is what I believe maybe more was the case in pre-Islamic Arabia. So you have polygyny with an N, where just a man or a woman may have multiple partners, is there. It happens. And that it is based, this is my I would not call it it's my hypothesis, shall we say, that it is based on economics and wealth. It's not based on gender. It's not based on religion. It's not based on that. And if I, as a man, am wealthy enough to have a second wife, or third wife, whatever it is, or a concubine, I'll do it. And that's what men did really throughout history. And what I'm saying is that in Arabia, there are episodes where it may have happened with women as well. I mentioned Maui as the case of the queen, the warrior queen, as one possibility, but there are others as well. So wealthy women or men could have multiple partners. That's my assumption. And then I give an example of polyandry is, so we have polygyny where any gender could do it, polygamy with an M, where men have multiple wives, and then polyandry where women have multiple husbands, so to speak. And there's it's just one inscription. It's a very small piece of evidence. We have Kamkam bint Wa'ila bint Haram she's Nabatean, probably a priestess. There's matrilineal. Those names that I mentioned they're all women names. She's named after, she's the daughter of her mother, who's the daughter of her mother, rather than daughter of father, etc. So it's matrilineal, not patrilineal. That happens a couple of times also in the Islamic, in the Arabic sources. One example I'll give again, if we go back to the cruel king, Al-Mundhir ibn Ma' al-Sama', right? He was named after his mother. And one thing that I argue again is I make a connection between Ma' al-Sama' and Ma'awiyah. Those have the same root, the same Semitic root. And you'll name a queen after another queen. You'll name, you have to have sort of prestigious names that you inherit. And I do think that matrilineal descent, the prospect of whatever polyandry, whatever it's there, especially in the pagan Arab world. There's some literature on it. I mean, I cite all of that in the next book. I mean, I have a whole chapter on just that polyandry, right, in Arabia. All of the literature on it. Layla Ahmed references it briefly, but then there are other scholars, and I'm happy again. I can get on another time. We'll talk about it, but it's too much right now, right? I argue that polyandry was curtailed with the increased conquest and conversion of Abrahamic religions. Again, same thing, and this is developed more in the third book. But if I can say one last thing about this, there's a famous hadith, right? And this is where the hadith is very, very valuable, right? It's it's a sahih from Bukhari or Muslim, right? These are the most authoritative collections for Sunni Muslims, right? And it says, prior to Islam, there were these 4 different kinds of marriage, and Aisha says this 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I dug up all the others, and I ended up with something like 24, 25 different ways in which men and women can be together, or the same gender, right? I mean, pre-Islamic Arabs had intimate relations in the same way that absolutely all human beings on earth do.
Mm.
And that's all it tells me. So I have to take that seriously. And where I fault some scholars or believers is that they take, they'll take whatever that hadith as a sort of, oh, look at them, look at how sinful they are, look at how messed up they are. No, they had a system. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the information, the data that we have from the Arabic sources, and taking it seriously.
Mm.
Rather than mocking it all day long and be like, oh, look at them, they have this weird marriage where one woman is like sleeping with like 3 guys. I'm like, yeah, that's because it's part of a system. So anyway, it's not a system that can pass muster for Christianity or for Islam, of course, and I get it, and it's okay. And again, but I said there are consequences, and by going back, we get to understand the world a little bit better. And it's not strange. I mean, there are separate discourses, whether they're feminist or progressive, looking at, oh, well, what would prevent a Muslim woman today from marrying this way or marrying that way, or does marriage have to be, something that is, this expensive wedding which has, all the sort of bells and whistles attached to it? Can just boyfriend girlfriend be? All these questions are being asked. It's in there. It's already in there. All we got to do is read and take it seriously. So.
One aspect of sort of queenship that you touch on in particular in the first book is the story of the Queen of Sheba in the Quran, and you argue a little bit about how it could be seen as maybe a homiletic retelling of the conquest and surrendering of Arabian pagan queens to the patriarchal monotheism spread by Abrahamic prophets, in particular in the story Solomon. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yes, I can. Let me just pull up, see if I can. So, the story of the Queen of Sheba in the Quran is told in Surah 27. That's where it really talks about, it's called the ant. The names of surahs are very interesting. They're so sort of, almost seems random, but it's not, right? It's like the ant. And the ant is so important. Like there's a message there. The ant is an important creature. Anyway, we're not here to talk about ants. Anyway, Surah An-Naml, and it's the ant that is, talking about Suleiman, King Solomon, because King Solomon can communicate with the animals, but then King Solomon's also conquering, the parts of his world, and he comes into contact with the Queen of Sheba, which again in the biblical narrative is Sheba is South Arabia. It is the place where they speak Sabaic, and where there is apparently a queen who rules over there. Now, we have zero archaeological evidence for the Queen of Sheba. We have actually no real evidence, no documentary evidence that she existed. We have, as I've mentioned prior, tons of evidence for queens like Sheba in the north, a whole bunch. And so there's already some scholarship about this, expressing that, there's, whether it's biblical or Quranic, I mean, there's not a historical queen in South Arabia. And King Solomon, who I don't know if we have, I have not researched. I don't think we have archaeological evidence for King Solomon. Maybe we do, maybe we don't, right? But I mean, if there is, and there were historical kings again that for a time period where the Hebraic people ruled over pieces of the Levant. If they got anywhere, it's just in a very small area. What's going to take them all the way to Yemen? How are they going to get there? How are they going to get that far? I mean, in a million years. So it's got to be some queen nearby. And again, even within the biblical narrative, there's all sorts of foreign queens who they don't like, and they're blaming them for. So it would seem, and I'm persuaded by it, that this is going to be a northern queen. And looking at Surah 27, at First Kings 10, 2 Chronicles 9, and the rabbinic and Christian literature, it's all in there. And as well as looking at history, I argue that this exchange in the Quran, and I won't read anything out of there. I mean, it's just, is that exchange between them is kind of, it's a retelling of all the rabbinic and Christian stuff, absolutely, but that it also goes back to the historical figures of Empress Zenobia and the Emperor Aurelian, Zenobia of Palmyra and Aurelian of Rome. And Aurelian was, and the Roman historians can correct me on this, but he's viewed as a pretty, he's pretty great, and according to the Roman historians in the Roman world, because there are some other Roman emperors who were pretty terrible. So these are two important characters who had came into conflict, where there was negotiation, and where there was a lot of literature and stories about. And in terms of giving gifts and having the gifts being rejected, and the king being sort of angry and and irate and intolerant, I argue that those things go back to this exchange between the two. If I can say one thing, maybe this is homiletic and you know, it's a certain kind of homily, but there's a very important line in Surah 27, and it should give everyone pause, right? It's like, and this is in the voice, I believe, either of the third person or of the queen, the woman, the only, woman who rules in the Quran, right? And in the Quran, this is in Surah 27, King Solomon is angry and he was there to conquer, and he's intolerant. He's not going to take no for an answer. The queen, on the other hand, is patient. She's consulting with her advisors, and she's very reasonable. She's a very reasonable woman who's under attack. And I am sure there are a lot of women who are listening to this can relate to that. You have to tread lightly, but you're in power. How do you not lose your power? You can't physically fight this guy. He's gonna outdo you. So there's a line which says, "Inna al-muluk idha dakhala al-ard afsaduha." Indeed, when kings enter the land, they ruin it. They ruin it entirely. And this is, to me, a critique, a condemnation of kingship within the Quran. And it's not strange to me that, again, afterwards, we don't have kings in Islam. There's no kings. There's no king of the Umayyad, the Abbasid dynasties. They behaved like they were more powerful than lots of kings, a whole lot of them, right? But in the Quran itself, there is a critique and there is a voice against, I would even say, the abuse of male power in the form of kingship. Really something we should think about.
Did the stamping out of, and I know in your book you mentioned that this did happen within the biblical context, but more so in the Quranic context, did the stamping out of the worship of female divinities by Abrahamic monotheism ever result in literal physical and sexual violence against women?
Okay, yeah, so this is a good question. And again, hard to answer. We don't have enough evidence to sort of answer this comprehensively again, but in parts. So let me say, in the Hebrew Bible, I would say, potentially yes, if the stories are true. I mean, there's a lot of stories in there which we don't know, right? And again, I talk about the murder and the mutilation of Jezebel and Athaliah, who were accused of spreading the worship of Asherah and Baal. The top, within the Canaanite world, within the Levant, those are the top gods, right? And leading the kings astray. So again, the Hebrew Bible has no qualms about saying, we butchered the false gods and false priests and so. Now, there's no evidence of such a thing in the Quran at all. Period. So the Quran again is very subtle and there are studies again. I think these are very popular articles. Which is more violent, the Bible or the Quran? Silly question with a silly answer. And you want the answer. The answer is the Bible. You ask a silly question, you got a silly answer. You happy? Okay, there you go. That's it. The Quran is not really that concerned with violence, and the passages that are in there have to do with. And Patricia Crone's sort of redemption, she had a nice way of saying it, which I can't recall right now, but it was not legislative, but sort of exhortative. Like it's like, hey, let's go defend, let's go fight the enemy. Not this is how you should treat all enemies forever, And there are a couple of passages in there which, of course, make you uncomfortable, but compared to the Bible, there is no comparison. So anyway. In the Hadith, you do get some stories. You get some sort of biblical style stories where you get the killing of the priest of Al-Uzza. His name is Dubayya, and Al-Uzza herself was a woman who was a tree that you kill and sort of dies. So it's not a real story, but the story is there. That's within the Hijaz. And also within the literature, the Arabic sources, you get punishing of priestesses in Yemen. Who would come out with red hands and they're sort of opposing, think Muhammad the Prophet, and they get punished for that. But those stories are connected with the conquests, the Arab conquests, not specifically with any sort of. There's no sexual violence there, and there's not a specific targeting of women that I can see of.
Had to do with the transition from polytheism or paganism to monotheism, more so about the what happens during conquest or war.
Yeah, it's part of conquest, and conquest is ugly. War is ugly. There's nothing pretty about it. But again, it's not with the what you mentioned, your sexual violence towards women. No, that's not what I see. And there's no evidence of it. Um, there may be some evidence in pre-Islamic Arabia. Again, like this bad stuff happens before the Quran, before Muhammad, right? So. And that's increased warfare. You have Roman-Persian wars. They start to go out of control, especially with between like little after 600 till about 620, 630. It's so bad. Like they're a war of attrition.
When
And
people thought it was the end of the world.
the people thought it was the end of the world. Yes, sir. Right? You have the Ayyam al-Arab, you have the literature, which Arabs are, their stories that people are sharing, I would say, for maybe decades, if not centuries, and then it gets committed to writing later. And then you have Abraha and the other folks. Like, there's so much violence going on prior to, in the 6th century. There's so much violence, and into the 7th century, that I would argue that it leads to sexual violence against women. So there's one example here, the sacrilegious war, Hurub al-Fijar. Um, this is interesting. There's so many wars that are sort of celebrated. And sometimes, like Dahz and Abra, this is the name of two horses. Some of them seem really silly. They're basically tribal wars. I have the fastest horse. No, I have the fastest horse. They race him and one loses, and now we have to have a war. Or one guy says, I'm the best of the Arabs, and he goes, I'm the best of the Arabs. And one guy cuts the other guy's foot off. Now we have to have a civil war. And I guess it's silly things. There is the sacrilegious war. These are where, they're fighting wars throughout the sacred months, and it's a sacrilege. There is there are, I think, three of these different wars that flared up. The sacrilegious war. There were three battles, and I think there was the sacrilege. There was the sacrilege of the woman, Fijar al-Mar'a. And that is a story of a tribe. I'm forgetting the tribes now, but a young man as a tribe came in on a woman in the marketplace. That means that the woman was physically going out into the marketplace, by the way, and sexually assaulted her. And that led to a war, or led to a battle, because she screamed out, and then her tribal people came, and then it got into it, and then it led to wars for several days, etc. That's the one example that I can find that really answers, does this Abrahamic conversion or this conquest, does it lead to sexual violence? I don't find, like, sort of concrete evidence, so to speak. There's the Hurub al-Fijar. There's one last thing I'll mention here. In the book, this is now the other book, the Female Divinity book, I talk about the Amulet of Alexandra. And I presented this at it's one of the recent conferences a couple of years ago. This is an old, it's a late antique Greek text, which I think there are two versions. One of I think it's preserved in Egypt somewhere, but it refers to this woman called Alexandra, or young girl, who lived in Beirut, in Lebanon. And I connect this to Surahs 113 and 114 because it's an amulet. So it's like saying, قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ قُلْ أَعُوذُ, etc. So it's like, I seek refuge from, say I seek refuge from. It's that same formula in there. Anyway, that's there. But in the amulet, it does ask for protection from sexual violation, and it goes into different. And the literature on the amulet of Alexandria that I cite also talks about how the Near East, the late antique Near East, became increasingly violent and unsafe for women because there were so many Roman soldiers patrolling. So that's there as well. And unfortunately, that's it's the dark side of human nature, but it's there. There's no evidence again that it's the Abrahamic conversion, but conquest. Yeah, I would say that the wars and the Roman soldiers and that stuff, and even the Arab civil wars did deteriorate, I would say, significantly the autonomy of women prior to the rise of Islam.
Just moving on sort of to the contemporary day now, and the relevance of your scholarship. To what extent do you think modern Islamic feminist readings of the Quran align with, or maybe myth, the cosmological and Near Eastern context you're focusing on in your work?
Yeah, this is another great one. Thank you for asking this. we had an ICSA conference in Palermo, Sicily, a couple of years ago. It's beautiful, right? And it was in the summer, it was very hot, and then we actually ended up sweating in the hallway, and it was actually quite painful, that part. But on the last day, we actually had a round table on women and gendered readings in the Quran. It was fascinating. It was awesome. A lot of the UK colleagues that you know were there, and I did not know what I don't know. I'm attending and participating. I did not know what would happen, right? And this question came up, and it became sort of the centerpiece of that roundtable at this, biennial conference. It's a really big deal. This international conference. We have all these gendered or feminist or related readings and approaches to the Quran, and they're over here, and then we have this sort of focus on late antiquity and other stuff over here. I think Dr. Omar D. Unzaga brought it up, and the colleagues that were there, it was well received. Karen Bauer was there as well. Dr. Bauer was there. I'm trying to think what else. Anyway, they discussed the questions like, why is you feminists are going here, and the other dudes maybe studying late antiquity are going here. Why aren't we combining these two? And it was a great, I think, learning moment for everybody in the room, including myself. And that roundtable was great because it emphasized the disconnect, I think, between where just two very different approaches. And if I can add to that, there is great scholarship. Again, I cite them to the extent that they're relevant in my study. There's Islamic feminist scholarship within, for the Islamic context within the Quran. By and large, they're concerned with an emancipatory reading and interpretations. They, in some cases, do have to reckon with and really reside within the sort of world of Sharia and, shaking things off. So it's law, state, theology, etc. They also are involved with modern social issues, which are extremely important, right? And there's a really huge emphasis on justice and equality. Of course there is, right? And I agree entirely. And there are examples that I've mentioned earlier. I mean, Amina Wadud has her Quran and Woman. Barbara Stowasser has Women in the Quran, Traditions and Interpretation. More recently, Aisha Hidayatullah has Feminist Edges of the Quran. These are terrific works. I love them. No connection to the Near East whatsoever, right? So that's there. So it is, I don't want to say it's a problem. It is just a reality, and it takes time for these things to happen. I think an organization like ICSA, which I, co-founded, is bringing together different colleagues, and we're able to sort of walk and chew gum now. And colleagues, I mean, I talk to doctors, Naveen Rida, Yasmin Amin. These are great colleagues, and they're Yasmin presented a paper on looking at the figures of Pharaoh's wife and Virgin Mary and the autonomy of women within the Quran. I'm like, yeah, you can build on that. There's a whole bunch of they're exemplars. If you just cross the border, into pre-Islamic Arabia, there's a whole bunch of them there. And then and Naveen does work also on Hebrew Bible, and she could, when I was talking to her about Ishtar and stuff like that, and she was, we were conversant with one another. So I think we just got to have these conferences and continue to have meetings of the minds. And I say that, of course, that's the force that'll bring us together, but the force that's pulling us apart all the time is we live in such a divisive world. It's just, politically, it's such a mess out there. I don't got to tell you, it's just, and it forces everyone into their tribe, into their teams, and you just, I got to fight for this, and it makes things like, justice and equality so urgent, and we, you don't have time to go. I'm going to talk about late antiquity, but I would come back and say that the struggle for justice and equality, and to fight against violence against women and men, and to end wars, this horrific, disgusting, I don't want to call it institution. It's a plague that is destroying humanity. That's part of the narrative also in pre-Islamic Arabia. Can we extrapolate? Can we learn things? And I think we can. Yeah.
Talking about the relevance of your work to today, do you see echoes of sort of the patterns that you're examining in how female religious authority is treated in the Muslim world today?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder what, I guess, uh, female religious authority, you said, right? What that would look like even today. I mean, my women colleagues, all of whom they are more qualified to speak about this than I. It's complicated. So I am aware, by the way, this is just a side note for this whole interview. I am a dude, I'm a guy, and I am aware of that. And I am profoundly interested in women in pre-Islamic Arabia and everything that entails. But I am still just a man, and I don't have the perspective that women have, or their experiences, or their knowledge. So this is one of those questions where they will know more than I do. And in my very, very inferior perspective in this case, I'll say that maybe patriarchal norms are just sort of common to all cultures today, and maybe throughout history, most of history. I would debate some of that again, especially looking at ancient Mesopotamia and how different groups mix. But Layla Ahmad in her Women and Gender in Islam, she has something in there. It's like all the cultures of the world have disagreements and disputes, but they all agreed to that, that men are better than women. And I'm like, yeah, that's ouch. That's how I take it. I don't have anything specific to say about, Islamic, you know, female religious leadership. Again, I don't really think that there is such a thing in a traditional sense. So of course we have in very, very modern days, Amin Odud, of course, is known, and she was in the public spotlight because of 2005. She led prayer for a mixed group, male and female group, and she was leading the prayer as a woman, and that, of course, raised a firestorm. I mean, among Muslims, right? It was just forget controversial. She was getting death threats. And it's something that when I used to teach, it's something that we would study that episode in history. There's also the Musawa movement, Musawah, Musawa being equality. That's the Arabic word, and it started in 2009. I think it's like housed in like Malaysia, other places. And I think it's interesting because that is a movement. I think probably Dr. Wadud and other people are involved in it. It's it's using sort of feminist methods um, to redefine Islamic laws, family law, right? And I like that because now, again, my inferior perspective as a student of feminist literature, as a student with a very, very small s, the Western varieties of feminism and the Islamic varieties of feminism are so different. They almost, I don't want to say they have one very small thing in common, which is, sort of, women should be equal to men. I get it. But the Western varieties of feminism, some of them they're so atomistic that the woman herself needs to be so powerful. Whereas in Islamic context, it's really the family that's the unit, even for the feminist scholarship. Now, I may not be speaking entirely correctly, I may be generalizing, but that stood out to me. So anyway, that doesn't totally answer your question. Like I said, they will know better, but there's good stuff out there.
One thing that you've alluded to throughout this interview, and I would love to get the answer is, what will the next installment in your trilogy on Arabian female power actually focus on? You've given us tidbits, but I'd love to know exactly what it is.
Yes, and I have the same question too. I am at the moment struggling a bit. I will tell you that the way I wrote this trilogy, I mean, I've published a couple of books before, and I have a couple the books that are not this trilogy coming after. They will come out, inshallah. Well, sorry, God willing. But writing this trilogy, and the 2 volumes have come out. The third one is still yet to come out. I wrote them. I dumped all the ideas down during COVID. So during the coronavirus pandemic, 2020 into 2021, I took 15 months and I sat down and I wrote 10 hours a day, 7 days a week for 15 months. And I wrote something like 200,000 words. And I cannot say I was in a very healthy state when I was writing that. So it was just all coming out. And I was, under a lot of stress because of because of the lockdown and the state of our world. So I was writing the whole time, and then now this last volume I have to really tidy up, because I can see that when I wrote it I was very maybe I felt like I was in a rush or something. But some of the things that I will discuss in there is reconstructing pagan polyandry, and matrilineality, marriage, divorce. And let me pause there for a second. So what is that not doing? I am not talking about, how can we fit this Sharia-minded marriage and divorce into pre-Islamic Arabia? And if it doesn't fit, then it's just a mockery. No, because again, women are tremendously important. The priestess, right? I mean, the temple in pre-Islamic Arabia is the same place you go to so you can have a baby, the same place you go to so you can get a bank loan, right? That's really important. You got to take it seriously. So that's what it'll be, sort of reconstructing some of those institutions. I'll give stories of notable examples, more heroes and poets, and some of the not queens, but other folks, as you'll be accustomed to from the first book. They'll include some Christian and Islamic notables, some Umayyads as well. There'll be some things that I'll say in there that will upset some people, not because I'm trying to, but because they're married to a narrative and this challenges the narrative. So anyway, and then it includes also discussion of how men climb the social ladder. So these are men who were very well known. Some of them are caliphs, right? Who climbed the social ladder through marriage to noble women. I mean, if you think about, I mean, Omar, Ali, other caliphs later on, Marwan, Abdulaziz, these are all well orchestrated marriages where the woman is the more important one. And by marrying her and that tribe and that religion and that social class, you move up. So that's really important. I'm going to put that in there as well. And then there is actually some work on this by Hala Wardi, Tunisian French scholar, Le Caliph Moudi. This is the cursed caliphs, not because they're cursed. It's Fatima bint Muhammad, the Fatima Zahra, who curses. And this is, of course, it's mainly in the Shia literature, but you have some of it. It's in the Sunni literature as well. I don't know if the curse is there, but just there's some violence there if you want to look for it, right? People don't want to really explore it, and I may not want to get into it, but exploring some of that, not the curse part, but looking how men climb the social ladder through women, and the curtailing of women's autonomy in the Hadith. Now, the Hadith does many things. I mean, it has a very important purpose in providing evidence for law and giving guidance and ritual and things like that. But there are things in there which are also just, I would argue, men expressing a very perspective which is unfavorable to others. So women, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, it gets to a point where Islamic religion becomes more reified and more rigid. This connects to Nadia al-Sheikh's work on women, Islam, and Abbasid identity, which is fantastic. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier about Hadith, Tehran, and how what we have today in traditional Islamic tradition, what is Abbasid tradition, right? That's what it is. Classical Islamic family law is Abbasid family law. That's what it is. And during the Abbasid period, that's when they were importing a whole bunch of slave women from, the Caucasus and from the Byzantine world and Abyssinian. And Nadia al-Sheikh, she does a terrific job of talking about how they're confusing, deliberately, I would say, right, the role of the enslaved woman with the betrothed woman, the married woman. And so that's not good. Right? That's not, it's fascinating, but it's also not good. So I'll stop there.
You completed both your books on female power.
So I was just saying that it seemed to have created a bit of an imbalance with the children who were the children of concubines versus the children of the first wife.
Yeah, there is that, and that's something I'll have to get into a little bit deeper. It also I don't know if it creates the problem of fratricide. I think that's a little bit separate. But hopefully I'll get into it and I'll have a better answer next time for you. Yeah.
No problem. And maybe I didn't articulate my, but it is something that, and you said a lot there that I won't get into as well, but like the matrilineal, the marriage of noble women, in order to elevate, to caliph. I want to say that Peter Webb in his book, on Arab identity kind of touched on that a little bit, in terms of after the prophet died, the caliphs that came about, seem to have been, whoever was in proximity closest to certain women. I'll just give the example, like Abu Bakr was the father-in-law of Muhammad, then Umar, father-in-law of Muhammad, because of marriage, and then you have Ali or Uthman Ali, who were sons-in-law of, and then after Ali, Muawiyah, who was a brother-in-law of. And I always found that kind of way that he laid that out very interesting, and it seems like that's something that maybe not in the exact same way you'll get into, but you'll definitely demonstrate how certain proximity to certain women also elevated men up to a certain social status.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Roxana, with your question.
Sorry, it's you already alluded to this, but you completed both of your books on female power at times when the world was sort of beset by crisis and conflict. How did these geopolitical events impact or alter your motivation in completing this project? And will the current events we're experiencing continue to affect your writing of the third book in the trilogy?
So yes, I feel that I work right now as a permanent full-time administrator, and I believe in transparency, not because it's some sort of great policy, it is for the most part, because it's part of my nature. I want to converse. I want to speak with people. I want to get to know them. I want to, share. I'd rather share than not share, always. So in that sense, I do share in my books, whether it's in the beginning or in the end, if there's some sort of motivation for me writing this book, or some sort of problem or some sort of challenge that I circumvent, I figured I'd share it because maybe other folks can relate to it and be like, oh, I'm not alone. And we are not alone in seeing that our world around us today is politically it's very divided, it's very divisive. We have wars raging, and even this week, there's escalation all the time. People on this side and on that side are worried about their families back over there, and it's quite terrible. And we live in a world where we have the little privilege of air conditioning, or I don't know if in Europe you all use air conditioning, or technology and Wi-Fi and roofs over our heads and food every day. And that's not guaranteed to people, of course, in war. And there's still something not right with the world. That's what I feel deeply inside. It's not right, and I can't stop. So I don't know. I don't know what that means, but I mean, I will say that we live in this world which is sort of addicted to endless war. And I would say that the world, the modern world, our modern way of life, our modern rule, our modern political system is something that is so addicted to just war all the time, and its derivatives that we have, whether it's bombardment, the different sort of mistreatment of people, the nuclear threats, it's civil wars. It's just so bad, right? And I feel that the more we learn about, from indigenous peoples and from different cultures, we might be able to find a way out. Now, I'm not, will human beings listen? No, they won't, right? That's the lesson. But the way, at least we'll know that there's another way. So, I do
I'm a
mention,
firm believer in educating ignorance, as a way of, people coming together and learning about each other. I'm somebody who takes great pride in learning about other cultures, because I'm genuinely interested, but I also see the value in doing that. I feel like I come a bit closer to those people, or come away with a better understanding. It does something to me that I think would benefit the masses. I'm pretty sure other people out there just as interested in other cultures and do the same thing. But I do see a lot of value in what you're saying.
yeah, thank you. I mean, like I said, The three of us, we're not alone in feeling this way. I think it's the majority of the planet feels this way. We're just stuck. And so anyway, I talk about indigenous poets here and there. There is something special I feel about a poet. There's a certain kind of artist who is speaking the heart, and I do feel also that by the kind of work that I do, you're excavating historical, philological, textual evidence. There are lessons from the ancients, right? You get lessons from old people. That just because someone is old and long ago doesn't mean that they don't know anything. It's quite the opposite. I feel that when we progress through time and we're obsessed with technology, we know less and less,
Right.
and we empathize less and less. And what I heard from what you're saying, Tehran, is that's empathy. Socrates he's not the first one to say, of course, that the highest level of the conclusion of learning is empathy. Empathy is natural to human beings, and the word for war in Arabic, even in the Quran, right, and is harb, haraba. And if we take that again, the two allophones, right, the kha and the ha, it's haraba and kharaba. Kharaba means to destroy, to ruin. War is, and again, in old Arabic, from an old Arabic linguistic perspective, war is ruin. War is not preemptive or strategic. There's no strategy other than just destruction of lives and of property. So that's a lesson. Oh, well, if that's what war is, then we should never do it, right? I mean, I know it's a bit naive, and I'll end with this. I mean, so Zainab Salbi, who's now Iraqi American poet, she says, or activist, pardon me, she goes, like life, peace begins with women. We're the first to forge lines of alliance and collaboration across conflicts, divides. I mean, the extent to which over the years, over my life, I've learned that how men, especially men in power, really just are destroying the planet in every way possible. Dude, let the women run the show, dude.
I think I might agree with you on that. Not I think, but you might be onto something with that. I think we've had enough guys at the wheel. Maybe it's time to hand it over because we haven't really been great stewards in that case.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I will continue to be affected by the world around me, and it will continue to influence the work that I produce. And I would add that no scholar asks an innocent question, innocent in the sense that, you know, if I'm writing about gender, it's because gender it's either traumatized me or it's meaningful to me. If I write about, ancient language or culture because I am personally from there or it affects me in some way. If I'm writing about this particular religion, it's because I converted or because it means something. It's always personal. Sorry, I know this is, oh my God, Abdullah Naim, professor of law in
Sudanese scholar.
yes, yes, you know him, yeah.
Yeah,
So
I read one of his books on Islam and secularism a while back, like over 10 years ago, though. But
excellent.
yeah, I tried to get him on one time.
Yeah, I must say you all have read quite a bit. This is and it's not a surprise. He said something to me when I met him. I met him maybe twice in life, and it hit me like a hammer. I will never forget. I thought to be a good scholar, you have to be cold and remote and and forensic. Nobody does that ever. And if they do, they're lying. We have to be we have to be prudent and try to be objective, etc. Yes, but he says, whatever you do in life, in your scholarship and your work, let it be personal and immediate. So I was like, yeah, sign me up. So I mean, for me, I'm putting it out there. So
All right, and that's a nice segue into our last question. You argued that gender is at the heart of understanding pre-Islamic Arabia and the development of Islam itself. What future scholarship do you hope to see on this subject that builds on your work?
yeah, so we talked a little bit about, connecting some of those dots and crossing the bridge with the feminists and the late antiquity folks, etc. I will say that right now, when I say now, I mean like the past maybe 20, 30 years, maybe 20 years or so. It seems like a bit of a golden age of scholarship on Quran and late antiquity. I mean, the whole idea of late antiquity studies is Peter Brown, 1980s or 90s, right? And then it sort of got popular after that. So it's all valuable. It's all good. There's a lot of good stuff coming out, and we all struggle to keep up. Um, I think the feminist scholarship, again, which is really, really important, it can just, it can expand its corpus to include late antiquity and pre-Islamic stuff. So if Pharaoh's wife is so important to me, well, what about, Maui as well? Or what about Zenobia? Why not include them? What's the reason not to? Um, and the corpus can be expanded, the exemplars and the case studies. So this would not be Islamic feminism; it would be pre-Islamic feminism. I don't think that we need to actually have that distinction. You can include them both.
Right.
Um, and there are examples of scholars that I've talked about this, and I'm hopeful about it. I think more storytelling. Queens and Prophets book, I try to use storytelling as a method. Storytelling is empowering. Storytelling is tied to identity formation. It is a more powerful way of communicating. I learned that also through time. You can deliver a sermon, not a sermon. You can just deliver a scientific talk. You can get someone in a white lab coat to give you all the right answers in life. They will list 100 things. A, do this. B, do this. C, and nobody's going to listen. If you tell them a story about how the good guy did this and the bad guy did this, and oh wow, and this drama, it's ingrained into our human nature. So I would say reconstructing life in pre-Islamic Arabia, that's partly what I'm going to do in the next book. But the more we can do that, and I mean reconstructing life, not just stating it. And it means that we as scholars have to learn a little bit more from the artists, I would say. Narrative nonfiction, why not? If we live in a world now where we're competing with, you mentioned Chat GPT and short attention spans. We need to write differently. We can't just be writing in the same way. Also, social history. We talked about that briefly, right? Not just talking about nobility, but what is going on the ground. Very hard to know, and I don't know how, to what extent we can do it. And also, what lessons can we learn from the ancients like today? What lessons can we learn about family, sustainability, policy, alternate ways to rule and behave and treat one another? So those are things we can look for. A colleague reached out to me, a European scholar, wants to talk about esotericism and the pre-Islamic world. There's a whole lot there as well. Esoteric, the mystical from the ancient Near East into the Islamic Near East. Totally, I mean, I would say uncharted. And there's so much over there, and it is very complicated, but there's so much material there that there's books in there you can do. And finally, why not more novels and documentaries and movies and plays and interdisciplinary grants, right? With different groups. I mean, again, as an administrator, I think about really, really broad, from the top down, and that in that sense, it's a good top down. I've been contacted again, the Queens and Prophets book. I got contacted by all sorts of people who wanted to do things, plays and movies and documentaries, but again, on other things as well. So I look forward to it, and like I said, I think there's a lot we can do, or a lot we can build on, and if we just be a little bit more artistic with it, yeah.
The Queens and Prophets book would make an amazing historical drama. It would be incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like that. I mean, it seems maybe I'd love. I mean, I'd love to see the work. All of us. I think every scholar has a sort of guilty sort of need and pleasure. Like, oh, I wish my work would be featured one day as a movie. We fantasize about that kind of stuff. So who knows? One can only dream.
Yeah, who knows? It might be a reality sooner than you think. But we immensely thank you for your time and all of your hard work. It was definitely a pleasure reading these two books. And I would like to read more of your other work, see what else you got in store, as well as what else you have coming down the pipeline. Is there anything that you would like to share with us before you take off with our audience? Any work that you would like to promote? The floor is yours.
Oh, that's kind of you. I mentioned the third volume of the trilogy is coming out. I have entirely separately. I have a book I'm co-editing on looking at hate speech and free speech with a colleague, Paula Sanders, in Rice University. It's a totally modern project, different. But again, it goes back to I as a scholar, I'm concerned with the world around us. So it's something that we're working on. There are future projects looking at, the Judeo-Christian conversion of Arabia to sort of Judeo-Christian found a new foundation. That's a whole other set of projects. And Yeah, those are a little bit more down the line. I have other unfinished projects here and there, and you can always, my academia.edu may be a little bit aged. It's maybe I haven't updated in the past year. You'll find my stuff on there. You'll find me on social. I'm not that active on social now, but maybe that'll change in the near future.
All right. Well, Dr. Emran El-Badawi, thank you for your time. Thank you for your hard work. And, we hope to speak to you again on some of your upcoming works.
Definitely for the third book, please, we would love to have you back for that.
Thank you, Roxana. Thank you, Tehran, for being so generous, for being such kind souls, for demonstrating as you all are role models. You read, you show humility, empathy, curiosity, all the things that honestly scholars and students we need to do more of what you're doing. And for this is quite a channel and a podcast y'all have put together. So it's been my pleasure, and hope to see you at the next one.